If you set out to change the world, where do you even begin? Some might start by changing themselves, be the change you want to see. But that has a limited impact on the world. To make a bigger difference, you need to change the views of others. Be an activist even. Maybe you do this by writing op-eds and columns. Maybe you do morchas on the streets. Maybe you become a mover and shaker in politics to shake things up. If you really care, then over time, you figure out those small ways in which you can help bring about big change. My guest on the show today thought long and hard about how he could help change the world. Fired up by deep emotion, he forged the road ahead with cold logic. Can there be a better combination?
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Parmesh Shahani, founder of the famous Godrej India Culture Lab and an advocate of LGBTQ inclusion in corporate India. Yes, that's right, in corporate India. Even as Indian society changes slowly, Parmesh works with corporates to help make them friendlier and more open spaces for LGBTQ people. He's written a fabulous book about this called Queeristan, which he describes as memoir plus manifesto. I was delighted to have him on The Seen and the Unseen to share his thoughts with me. Before we move on to our conversation though, let's take a quick commercial break. If you enjoy listening to The Seen and the Unseen, you can play a part in keeping the show alive. The Seen and the Unseen has been a labor of love for me. I've enjoyed putting together many stimulating conversations, expanding my brain and my universe, and hopefully yours as well. But while the work has been its own reward, I don't actually make much money off the show. Although The Seen and the Unseen has great numbers, advertisers haven't really woken up to the insane engagement level of podcasts, and I do many hours of deep research for each episode, besides all the logistics of producing the show myself. Scheduling guests, booking studios, paying technicians, the travel and so on. So I'm trying a new way of keeping this thing going, and that involves you. My proposition for you is this. For every episode of The Seen and the Unseen that you enjoy, buy me a cup of coffee or even a lavish lunch, whatever you feel is worth. You can do this by heading over to seenunseen.in/support and contributing an amount of your choice. This is not a subscription. The Seen and the Unseen will continue to be free on all podcast apps and at seenunseen.in. This is just a gesture of appreciation. Help keep this thing going. seenunseen.in/support. Parmesh, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I remember we were at TED in 2009. That evening in Mysore, music, happiness, so much possibility. Did you imagine 11 years later, here we would be?
What's kind of fascinating is that, just for the listeners, we were both TED India fellows when TED happened in Mysore in 2009, the actual TED, not some TEDx. And Parmesh and I were both TED India fellows. And the interesting thing is that for me, it was just an event. It came and it went, and it was nice to meet all these people, but I didn't think much about it. But reading your book, I sort of realized that it's played a slightly more important role in your journey than in mine, which is, so interesting to me, how, the same event can have such a different impact on people. You've described your a book at the start as a memoir plus manifesto.
Yeah.
And it kind of seemed to me that even the manifesto part of it, in a sense, is it's almost a lived manifesto. So that's also, in a sense, it arises out of the memoir. And I'd like to sort of, before we get to your book, which I really enjoyed reading and learned from, but before we get there, I'd like to kind of explore the memoir part a bit and, ask you more about your personal journey and how that's been. So tell me a bit about that, about, growing up as a middle-class kid, first in Colaba, then you went to the Middle East, coming back to Bombay, navigating all of that. Tell me a bit about that.
So yeah, it was interesting to reflect, to look back in the book. The aim was always, I think with both my books, right? Gay Bombay that came out first. Gay Bombay actually was the book that got me into that TED India. Because the book had come out in 2008 and I applied using that, and I got to come to this conference and meet all of you. So even that book, which was very much an ethnography, That was an academic book that came out of my MIT program, that came out of research. So it was digital ethnography, it was anthropology, it was LGBTQ studies, it was so many of those things. But even over there, I kind of had placed myself in the middle of all the stories I was telling. And this format actually comes very much from my schooling and from my, not while growing up, but from my academic training. So the program that I did at MIT, for example, comparative media studies, is something that Henry Jenkins, William Uricchio, these incredible scholars whom I love and admire so much, began. And it was very much a program that kind of, I want to use the word queer here. It queered media studies because it kind of queered academia, not in the sense of talking about queers, which of course it does. Queer people, queer lives, queer hopes, but also how do you do academia? How do you tell stories? And that's also been the kind of change in anthropology over the years, right? From a researcher being someone who goes to a distant land to study the other and, lives in, immerses, and themselves into that culture and then writes up about it as a distant observer. Anthropology over the years, media studies, all these disciplines have become very much about the intimate, about what does it mean when you study your own self? What does it mean to reflect, on your own journey while you are studying others like you, not others different from you? And what does that do to the research? So the method of Queeristan, which is deep personal mixed with facts, figures, data, other people's stories, was actually, I've honed it more in Queeristan, but, the initial experiment almost was Gay Bombay. And that came from my training, which also kind of validated. So one of the beautiful things about being in that program was, my professors were like, your background matters, your experience matters. We don't want to wipe out everything you are and where you've come from and train you to be a particular kind of scholar. We want you to inform your scholarship with all of these. And that was so amazing that, Henry was an incredible mentor, especially in this. And if you see his own scholarship, right, whether about comics or video games or Star Wars, he actually started the field of fandom studies, which now over the years has become, a legit academic pursuit. He was like, it's all about the personal, right? So that personal memoir meets manifesto thing has its origins, in my training, in the validation I got from my program that you can talk about, you can reflect on your own journey seriously. And I tried to do that for various reasons, because I thought it was also very, very important in Queeristan, which is a business book. And so many of the business books that I was reading or that I tried to read to prepare for this were just about business, or they just put you in and they said, 5 things to do, 6 things to do, case study here. I was yearning, I was thirsting to know more about the people behind those decisions, right? Why are you doing this? Why are you recommending I do these 5 things? Or like, why are you recommending I swim in this blue ocean? Or, why you, like, I kind of thought that it would be really nice to write a deeply personal business book. Because in a sense, what I was also trying to do in this book was to visibilize, right? So large parts of the book are, cases, steps, etc. But really a large part of the book is, for people who might not have met queer people, this is us, this is our lives, right? This is my life, this is my personal journey. This is what has happened to me when my family has accepted and my company has accepted. This is how my background has played into, the privileges that I have and that I can use at this point to kind of strategize in whatever way I can for, to create a more inclusive playing field and things like that. So I thought it was very important to put all those personal bits in, even before we reach the business parts. So a reader kind of knows me. They're like, we understand this Parmesh. We understand not just where he's come from, but, also all the other things in the book, right? So I thought that also kind of would open them up more to kind of have that empathy to understand the case and then to do, which is what I really want them to do at the end of the book, which is implement those steps. So putting that personal in was very strategic, and it has always been very strategic for me in both my books. It's not indulgence. It's very much a conscious act of creating that link of empathy with my readers so that they come with me on this journey.
So I had a couple of observations. The second one sort of going into a question, and they're both kind of tangential. And one is that, firstly, I think that worked beautifully, the fusing of the personal with whatever the book is about. So it never felt like a business book. That manifesto feel doesn't really come across. I mean, out of the five parts, you could say the fourth part is one which actually, talks about what companies can do. And even there, you weaved in the personal, but it worked beautifully as a story. My second observation, and also perhaps a question, is that, one of the other questions I had, which I first noted down before I even started reading the book, that I want to ask Parmesh about, when he was growing up, the process of getting comfortable in his own skin, which is hard for anyone, which was hard for me as well. So it doesn't matter what your sexuality or anything might be. All of us are so anxious about fitting into the world that just reaching that stage where we are comfortable with who we are is a journey in itself. But that seems to also have found a very interesting reflection in the voice of the book, where at first I was taken aback because, there are so many places where, and I always say with writers I know that when you read something by them, because their writing is authentic, it sounds like you can hear their voice speaking out. And that's even more in your case because, somewhere you'll say, no, Baba, and you'll continue. Or at the end of saying something, you'll say, Hannah, and which was very interesting. And, the first couple of times it startled me a bit because you don't expect that kind of a conversational, informal tone in a book. So what was sort of, is that something that you thought about, that the voice has to be me, and it has to be me to the extent that it has to be, that process of people hearing your voice feels more explicit, So is that something you thought about? Did your publisher have a problem and say, "Ki, arey, what is this? No, Baba, cut it out"?
Oh, yes. And I hope she's listening to this, and I hope she realizes how much people like it, because we didn't have many arguments through the book. But if there was one bone of contention, it was this. For Westland, it was very much, Parmesh, this is a business book. You are not Shobha Day. And then I was like, Arey, but I can be Shobha Gay. And I told Shobha also this, and we met, and uh, they were like, no, 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 don't forget it's a business book. And I was very much key, but it's my business book, na, darling. And the way I think of business is different, na. So, and that was the point. So if you read at some point, I think I should do a director's cut of the book with all the bits that were left out. If you see what was on the chopping table, it's essentially a whole bunch of this. They were like, okay, love it, but I think maybe it's becoming too personal. Why we need to tell this? Why we have to say this? Can you every time not say, Arey Baba, this, this, this? And I was like, but this is... So then we reached one, like any good editor, publisher, author relationship. And as Seema auntie likes to say, it was all about compromise and adjustment. I was like, look, my voice is important. Here is what we are going to... I think here I want to talk like this. And they were like, okay, here is very good. But maybe here, if we make it little more serious, little more this, little more that, because remember, it's ultimately a business book. So, but I'm glad that the voice came through, because I was really afraid that, I really wanted it to sound like me. Which is why also while recording the audible version, I mean, I could just read it out because it's like I, thought of it. And if you read the audible version, it's exactly like that. It's like I'm sitting next to you and taking you on this journey.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I came across some of those, and I think they're right there from the preface, I was, with my editor's hat on, I was a little bit like, okay, this, the reader will notice this, it snaps him out of the narrative, is it a good thing? But as I went on, I found it, A, charming, and B, authentic to the person. So you feel that this is actually, someone sitting across you and talking the way they talk, even if they don't know you. And I thought that really worked for me. So kind of getting back to your sort of the early part of your memoir, what was it sort of like growing up in 80s, 90s, Mumbai? And, in terms of, you often said that you didn't have an issue with figuring out your sexuality, but with articulating it. So take me a bit through those years and what it was like.
Yeah, it was... I mean, everyone is nostalgic about their past. And as you're saying 80s, 90s, I'm thinking of this Bappi Lahiri album called Habiba. I don't know if anyone else remembers it, but I do. This is before Made in India. This is before pop music, right? This is before MTV. And Bappi Lahiri had released this incredible music album. I mean, a non-film music album called Habiba, which I still remember so much. And we were not that rich. So, to get a cassette was something, and how much I argued with my mom saying, I really want it. And she was like, but it's a cassette. It has one song on it. You'll get tired of it, because that was essentially, it was Habiba multiple times. It was a single. But, it was so different. It was so innocent. I suppose every generation looks back at their childhood with wistfulness and, with that sense of innocence. For me, it was also pre-internet India, right? So, access to information was not very easy at all. And in my case, it was, as I write in the book, it was a very, we lived in we were middle class, I suppose. We lived in a one-room house in Colaba. I went to St. Joseph's High School, RC Church. I was in the greenhouse, the best house. And I used to go to school by BST. In those days, it was a big thing, because in the moment 7th standard got over, you would wear long pants and you would say, I'm not taking the school bus, because it was like a matter of pride to like take the BST and go to school by yourself. It was a big thing, and I would do that. And I was always very, I suppose, and, I'm glad that you said that even it was a process of, even how does one realize one's own straightness, right? It's not like, but I suppose if you're straight and you live in a heteronormative society, it's not a big thing. At some point, I suppose you realize that you are attracted, and then you're comfortable with it, because that's the way that everyone around you assumes that you will be in any case. But when you're queer, it's different, right? Because you live in a society which kind of expects one thing. But I was always really very comfortable. With me, it was in 8th, 9th, 10th that I became aware of the fact that I was, emotionally and physically attracted to other boys. I had a lovely boyfriend, I suppose, in school. Of course, we didn't use that term. We didn't know the term. But we knew that we didn't even know the term homosexual or gay. What we knew is that we liked each other and we enjoyed each other's company. And, one thing led to the other, and we were very, comfortable. It seemed right. It seemed natural. And, as I write in the book about how, one day we were walking, holding hands. And again, it was, boys could hold hands and walk. Even I suppose today boys can, but like in those, we were very happy holding hands and walking together near the gateway. And one of the seniors, because I remember we were in the 9th standard, and one of the seniors looked at us from school. He saw us and he was like, you both are homos, kya? And it was the first time we'd heard that word, homos. So, we went back home and tried to do research. And the next day in school, he was like, this homo is not a good thing. I don't think we should be homos. And I was actually quite relieved that there was a word. I was like, it doesn't feel like a bad thing. And he was like, no, we should focus on our board exams, because, 10th standard is, that's what you're obsessed with. And I found it very strange because, I didn't think that there was anything wrong or something to be ashamed about, but he did. So he kind of recoiled. And I just remember, it was interesting. It was sad because I liked him very much. And, but for me, it was it was always, I was always comfortable. So it's just that later on when you discover that, okay, it's homo, there's gay, this is what it means. You learn more, you read more, you understand more. Earlier, of course, I think, which is also why the current generation is so blessed, because, there are so many role models, stories, whether, books, films, web series, websites that talk about being queer in an Indian context. Whereas, in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, which is when I was in school growing up, it was like you had to like search for maybe there will be a little clipping talking about Boy George, or maybe there'll be a hint of Freddie Mercury, or maybe there will, George Michael at some point will come out and it will be gasp. George Michael is gay. Or, it was that, right? We were like, so even when you're comfortable, you want a context. And for me, I wanted a context of being queer in a desi way, all the foreign role models, etc., were nice, but, it didn't feel like my experience. And, which is also, I guess, why ultimately when I went off to study further and all, my first book was about what does it mean to be queer and Indian. It was largely about Indianness, about Desi Pan. So that's what it was growing up. It was about Doordarshan and He-Man, and it was about, different kinds of friendships. It was about long walks. It was about, I guess there were less distractions, so I could, spend time to read. I used to live with my grandparents. So one of the pleasures of my life was then every evening going for a long walk with my grandfather. And he would expose me. He didn't study much, but he would go for and of course we were not rich, but we would go to Jahangir Art Gallery every time a new show would open, and we would look at the art, right? And we would walk. And I think that, so it were formative years in terms of just understanding myself, feeling very comfortable with who I am, but of course not being able to share this with my parents or grandparents or even friends for that matter, because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to articulate it. And then, my dad got a job in the Middle East, and that was a very different kind of, because in the 80s and 90s, being a simple middle class kid, and in India where everything is prohibited, and then suddenly being able to go, and it wasn't a great job. I mean, he was working in a supermarket, but it was, to go on a plane, to be able to actually buy Toblerone, to see a supermarket. All these things were quite exciting. So it was a way out of middle class mundaneness into this really exotic world of wow, all this happens. And
in fact, the phrase that you've used in your book for it is you've called it, quote, a journey out of middle class frugality to Toblerone heaven.
Correct.
Which, yeah. A tangential sort of thought strikes me here that, being, someone who sort of grew up at the same time and all of that. And I just felt this wave of nostalgia when you just used the word cassettes.
Yeah.
Because, it was such a big deal for us in those days to discover new music, to somehow plan and scrape together a mixtape of the stuff you like and all of that. And equally, like you point out that, it's almost difficult today to imagine a world without the internet, as difficult as it would have been for us to imagine a world without electricity, maybe.
Yeah.
And it kind of strikes me, therefore, that, do you think that the whole experience of growing up and discovering yourself is then becomes very different? Because like you pointed out, you mentioned that you went on long walks with your grandfather, and I'd imagine that if you're growing up today, you're not going on so many long walks with your grandfather, because you're bombarded all the times by so much for your senses, by so much information. There is so much to discover. And on the one hand, of course, kids growing up today are just the luckiest generation ever because they have all this at their fingertips. But, is there something you think lost in the fact that they don't have that time and that space to sort of be with themselves and so on?
I think so, for sure. And now, I'm sounding like an uncle already. So everyone who's listening to this will say, sit down, uncle, or shut up, uncle, or something. But I think there is something different from not being connected, right? So even now, I go for walks with my partner who happens to be younger than me, different generation. And it's hard to walk for 10 minutes without him whipping out his phone and taking a picture for a future Instagram story. So, and then he's like, we have to think of the story also. I'm like, okay. So I think there is fundamentally different. But even with us, right? One is so attached to the gadget right now. One is so attached to the screen right now. So it's not just younger people. I think we've also fundamentally in some way, culturally and, physically, in terms of how we experience things change. But it has pros and cons, right? The pros is you have a lot of time, etc. The cons is when you're growing up in an economy which is frugal, in a world where information is limited, it takes you a long time. So, my generation, our generation of people come out a lot later. People spend years. And in my case, I didn't struggle with self-acceptance, right? It was, I was comfortable. So many people in our generation torture themselves, about whether what they are feeling or who they are is normal or not. So many destroy their own lives and the lives of others by conforming either to the pressures of an arranged heterosexual marriage and so many other things, right? So I think for today's, for younger people, for today's generation, I'm just so glad that there is an ecosystem built for those who can access it, so that they can learn, they can, understand themselves, they can, express themselves, and they can imagine a better future for themselves in whichever way they wish, right? So I don't want to be too nostalgic and romanticize and say everything was good. I mean, in those days, of course, it was our childhood, so it was good. But young people today have so much more access to, to knowledge and opportunities, and that's excellent as well.
Yeah, and it struck me as kind of poignant and charming, but poignant also that you speak about how, you watched Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak, and then you made a fantasy out of it and called it Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak, where, Amir is romancing you instead of Juhi Chawla, which is charming, but it's also poignant because it sort of indicates what you were just speaking about, that the search for role models is so futile that you have to eventually find it in your own fantasies. And that
we didn't have Made in Heaven, right? Where you see a gay couple, or Four More Shots where you can see a lesbian wedding or whatever, right? So we had to interpolate ourselves into these stories and imagine that Sholay is a gay bromance, and of course Jay and Viru are gay, and that's true by the but because we didn't have My Brother Nikhil or Aligarh or Ik Ladki or Shubh Mangal, where it's very clear in the first 10 minutes that they're gay, there's a gay kiss, and then the story goes on. So yeah, we had to fantasize, we had to imagine, we had to.
And another thing that's kind of struck me in many different contexts is that, being born a straight person in a heteronormative society as I am, my identity doesn't really play a big part in my life. I can take it for granted. I don't have to think about it. Whereas if you're a woman, or if you're gay, or if you're any number of things, if you're Dalit, that identity is like an extra layer that you always have to be aware of, and you carry it with you, and it kind of factors into everything you do. Was that sense of that extra layer strong in you? Was there a sense of frustration at kind of, having to navigate the world with that, that extra layer of awareness attached to it, which, most people around you would not have to bother with?
So Amit, here I would like to disagree. And I would like to say that I don't think ki as a straight person, your identity does not play a role, or that you are not conscious about it. In fact, a lot of good academic research now is coming up about straightness or whiteness, or, all these things which are the majority that you assume need not think about themselves, need not have issues, need not be conscious, need not articulate themselves. So straight people also articulate their straightness in different and unique ways. And in fact, I've been really toying with this idea of doing another book called Straightestan, where I understand straight people and immerse myself in their world and just see what it's like. What does it mean being straight? How were you like when you were 9 years old growing up straight in India? So I think a lot of us, I think we're all conscious of the various facets of our identity. But certainly when you live in a heteronormative, patriarchal, and in India, a casteist society which is oriented towards certain things, when you happen to be the majority, it's a luxury to imagine that you don't have to think about certain things, right? So as you said, when you feel you're not the majority, these things, you become slightly more conscious of it. So that's the thing. But I don't think, I think if you're upper caste, you are conscious or you are aware, and your identity really frames everything that you do, in the confidence you have, in how you physically navigate through space, how you fill up a space, how you, have just imagine that you have access to things, and so on, in a way that someone who's not upper caste might not. Same way with men, right? And that's what's so interesting. In fact, another TED fellow, Jasmine Pathija, from that same 2009 conference, has done these incredible experiments with blank noise, where she and, fellow artist activists go to public spaces and just see what it does to men when they occupy those spaces in a way that men do. So for example, 10 women sit on a parapet, put one leg up on a wall, spread themselves, because men tend to spread themselves. And when men pass by, these women look at them and do, or whatever, make noises. Or go and lie down in a park and occupy that space in that sense, right? In a way that, and then they'll record reactions of men because men have never seen women in that sense be comfortable together in a public park or lying down. Or it's very strange for men to walk by and have a group of women maybe call them out. But it seems very normal for the opposite to happen in that sense, right? So I think, when you're not in the majority, then you are conscious of that difference for sure. If you're a woman in India, you're conscious. If you're, if you're Dalit, if you're queer, if you're Muslim, you would be conscious of how you navigate, the spaces, but also how you think of yourself, how you imagine, a future for yourself, how you negotiate, various aspects of yourself. So certainly for me, while my queerness is not the only part of me that I talk about. I mean, I'm also Sindhi, and and that comes out in so many ways. I love bling, of course, and so many other things. I mean, there's so many aspects of my identity, but but certainly in it's tough. These are aspects that I am conscious, that I would be slightly a little more conscious about. But by that, I'm not saying that you are also conscious of your straightness and the way you express it in different ways.
No, I mean, I don't dispute that. And obviously, in the world we live in, straightness is itself an enormous privilege of a sort. What I kind of meant was that, let's say, for example, just to take the male-female context, if I want to go out for a walk at 11 p.m., I don't have to think twice. If I get into an elevator with five strangers, I don't have to be on high alert, and I don't have to have that extra layer of alertness, which women will naturally have just because of the world that we unfortunately kind of live in. But, I sort of, by your point there, my other question is, like you pointed out, and, one of the things that, through the book you've spoken of how all of us have many selves and therefore can't just be sort of, and that it's a danger to be defined by one particular kind of identity. And it struck me there that, being gay in a heteronormative society where there is so much discrimination and prejudice and all of that, when it is such a big deal, how much then does that part of your identity sort of shape and define your life? Like, supposing we lived in an entirely just society where none of this existed, where it was as normal to be gay as to be straight, as normal in the sense, in the way of how society treats you and all that, what direction would your life then have taken? It's kind of moved in this directions because, you've been kind of driven by this great cause at some level. Maybe it begins with self-discovery and then it goes on to trying to make the world a better place. But what if the world did not need to be made better in this way? What would you be doing today? Who would, Parmesh Shahani have been? Would you still be in management at a top company? Would there be any reason to be there? Would you be maybe an artist or something? What would you be?
I can still be all those other things too. No, I think in my case, I've been really blessed. And I talk about these multiple privileges in the book as well as something that really, really pushed me to create, more fairer ecosystems for everyone. But I've been blessed in the sense that I've had, while I didn't grow up in wealth, I've had like very supportive parents, who could give me an education, at least in India until college level. And then, when I went to the US, I got it on scholarship. But to have that support, even in terms of sexuality, when I came out, it was easier with my mom. My dad took some more time, but there was never a rejection. And there was never that drama of like, you become straight otherwise, or like a lot of queer people go through real hell. There's no other word for it. They go through torture by their own parents and families, whether it is things like conversion therapy, which is sickening that it's still happening, whether it is forced heterosexual marriage, all the way up to people's own families torturing their own children, killing them, all of that, right? So all that happens in our country, not just if you're queer, but if you're different in any way. So given that range of horrible things that might have happened, I think, to have, parents who love and understand you is the biggest blessing and the biggest privilege, which is why a lot of my book, Queeristan, is about this parental gaze and this parental framework as something that is so vital. I've had schools and colleges which have, been in different levels supportive. I've been blessed with workplaces of, different kinds, which have, even if they've not been supportive, they've not been overtly discriminatory. And these are all blessings And, whether it's having academic, the fortune of going to a place like MIT or like, doing classes at places like Yale and all of that, which has like opened my mind up to not just possibilities, but also networks of like just amazing, inspiring people. Some of whom I write about in the book, right? People like Ahmad Katrada, who unfortunately is no more, who was in the next cell of Nelson Mandela on Robben Island, and who spoke to me about hope and forgiveness and resilience. So many people, right? Assam Dawood, who's doing incredible work on refugees in Israel and Palestine. And there's so many incredible people whom I've met through this, through my education journeys. So I think I would have been doing exactly this because, I don't think I would have been doing anything different had we been living in a more heteronormative. I think I would have been working on the different things that interest me. I would have been trying to connect them together. And in a way, this is where I'm going to even now, because, one of my realizations over the past 10 years and in between the two books has been very much about intersectionality. This is something that I've learned completely from the young people that I've been lucky enough to hang out with and learn, my own team members. So many of the people that you encounter in the book, whether it's Professor Dhiren Borissa from OP Jindal, whether it's Grace Banu, who's an incredible trans rights activist from Tuticorin in Tamil Nadu, whether it's Rafiul, who runs the Queer Muslim Project, whether it's Aro, who along with an incredible team run Dalit Queer Project, and people whom I haven't met, whether it's Greta Thunberg or others, right, all around the world are trying to create, or Malala, or so many other of these inspiring people around the world who are just trying to create a better world in terms of environment, gender, and so on. Even my own learning over the past 10 years has been that if you care about queer rights and queer inclusion like I do, you really have to contextualize these in the context of, other movements for social change and social justice. And you really need to, in a sense, build bridges of solidarity with others, because we can't say that you want a more better world for queer people only and not recognize that the struggle is linked to the anti-caste, movement, or the movement for a better, cleaner environment, or Black Lives Matters in the US or other parts of the world, and so many other social justice movements which are happening all over the world, all powered by young people. So my thinking has grown because of the people I've encountered and met into realizing the intersectional nature of, the struggle. That's one. And the other is in realizing that the interconnected nature of what the solution might be. So a lot of Queeristan, the book itself, talks about the fact that we live in a world where companies, NGOs, different governments, national, state, municipal, will have to come together in different ways, in different formations to solve some of these issues. Because the challenges are not something that, any one of these stakeholders will be able to do by themselves, right? So, this is where my mind is moving towards more and more. How do we create? They needn't be tight networks of collaboration. They could be loose for certain, projects or things. As we saw post-COVID, for example, we saw companies come forward and give money and resources. We saw incredible NGOs come together and organize relief. We saw state governments that, got into action and helped and empowered things like that, which is why, some of the stuff could happen. So I think a lot of the future is going to be about this. And my thinking is that, I would have anyway been on this track, even otherwise. Now I'm more and more on just thinking about what would it mean to build these other kind of connections, these other kind of solidarities, and move ahead. And I've completely rambled, but yours is a long form podcast, so that's wonderful.
Yeah, rambling here is a feature, not a bug. That's what the listeners kind of appreciate. I'm sort of, some fascinating strands in what you just said. And one, of course, is, you mentioned Ahmed Katrada, who was, Mandela's cellmate. And you recount this fascinating bit in your book where he was showing you around the cell block where the two of them were housed.
Yeah.
And the part that really jumped out at me over there is about how he was talking about, it took us 10 years of agitation to be allowed to read newspapers and 15 years of agitation to sort of be allowed pen and paper or whatever.
Yeah.
And, those were the kind of time spans that you're talking about, where you just keep trying. You don't know if it will happen in your own lifetime, and you make incremental progress at 10-year and 5-year chunks. Whereas, in these modern times, perhaps that's vastly accelerated by social media and globalization. Would you say that's the case? Like there's one passage in your book also that kind of struck me, which is about the impact of liberalization on the gay movement. Where at one point you write, I'll quote your words, quote, "Consider the designer Genjam Gadi, who hails from Tirbin, a remote village in Arunachal Pradesh. Electricity came to his village only in the late 1990s. He stumbled upon fashion while going through old issues of Femina. Imagine the journey of transportation from the northeast to Delhi, possibly because of new post-liberalization air routes, of education at Wigan and Lay College, possible because the post-1990s needed new kinds of colleges, of internship with Rohit Bal, the legend who attended Genjam's graduation at which he won Best Designer, of his debut Fashion Week presentation, possible because there was now a network of such biannual shows offering visibility to young talent, and of sales. Again, this post-liberalization India had created a new customer base eager to consume fashion." Stop quote. And this is, again, sort of tangential, but it strikes me that in a lot of activism, especially left-wing activism, free markets and capitalism are often given such a bad name. While the way I kind of look at markets is that markets are the way by which a society fulfills its own needs. Voluntary actions zindabad, so to say. And this is also something that you seem to have embraced, because rather than sort of work in a dusty NGO and work in villages in the bylanes of towns, one of the things that you do is, work within a company, work with corporates to actually make things better on the ground. So in this one aspect, you seem to have a more optimistic view than many other activists would. Is this something that you've thought about, or is this something that you that you evolved towards, or did you always sort of disagree with the demonization of markets and evil capitalists and so on?
No, I don't disagree with the demonization of markets and evil capitalism. There is a lot of merit in the criticism of capitalism, and we have seen it in the past few years, right? Piketty has written about this, as have so many others, whether it's Amartya Sen, Jean Drèze in India, and so many others, about how inequality, and even Abhijit and Esther, right? Who work so much on poverty, right? So clearly, our world is becoming more and more unequal. And one of the perils of capitalism is that it has been widening inequalities, and that has been terrible. And capitalism is good in so many ways, right? And in that passage that you read out, it shows you the liberating, both in an imaginative and in an economic sense, power of capitalism. Say for young Genjam and the leap that Genjam has been able to make, but in so many other cases, that's great. But in so many other cases, certainly, capitalism has led to a widening of inequalities. And so I think it's really time to reimagine capitalism, really look at this inequality and figure out how to, stem it, stop it, reduce it. Cannot continue like this forever.
Can I interject and sort of make a larger point about economic inequality, which I keep making, is that I think people who worry about economic inequality commit what I call the zero-sum fallacy, where they assume that there is a fixed amount of money in the world and therefore inequality is bad because if the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Obviously, in a zero-sum world, more inequality would mean more poverty. But what happens in developing countries, and what has certainly happened in India over the last 30 years, is that inequality has grown as poverty has declined, because we're not in a zero-sum world. Every voluntary transaction leaves both people better off. So what post-liberalization estimates say there have been some 300 million people come out of poverty, which to me is a moral triumph, because poverty is, to me, India's biggest problem. And the solutions for poverty and inequality are very different. You could solve inequality in a flash by making everybody equally poor. And I kind of go by what Harry Frankfurt calls the Doctrine of Sufficiency. Harry Frankfurt is a philosopher who's written this great book called On Inequality, and he's also written a fabulous book called On Bullshit, which kind of describes a lot of what comes out of Trump and Modi these days. But the phrase that he coins is a doctrine of sufficiency, where he says that what is important is to go by, how absolute levels of poverty are, that the doctrine of sufficiency essentially states, and I'm obviously paraphrasing here because it's from memory, that everyone should have enough to kind of whatever suffices to live a good life at least. And therefore, India, I think a lot of our dialogue about inequality doesn't take this into account. It assumes that there is a zero-sum world. But the point is that as poverty declines, inequality will go up. And in fact, in India, vice versa. But the larger issue of the zero-sum fallacy, and I'm just thinking aloud here, it seems to me can also, crop up in certain kinds of activism where, the way I see it is that I would love all individuals to be empowered and have the same kind of opportunities, and we can all grow together. And yet there is a sense in some kinds of dialogue and some kinds of discourse that people with X identity are enemies of people with Y identity, and it almost has the feel of a zero-sum game that, X oppressed us for centuries, or X broke our temple and made a mosque, or whatever. It can come from either the right or the left, and therefore as Y we must stand up and take revenge, which again sort of to me seems to be stuck in that kind of mindset. This is not really leading to a question, but since you kind of brought it up, I thought I'll just kind of state this counter view.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with you that zero-sum games are limiting, which is why the book is very much about win-win scenarios and
Exactly.
across everyone, which is also why the book has a range of individuals across the spectrum in it. It's an inclusive book in the sense that it has people who might be right-leaning, it has people who might be left-leaning, it has people who are centrist. And to get back to your question earlier about a tension, say, between activism and capitalism in that sense, I actually think, I don't think of it as oppositional. I think a lot of the work that we are doing, and we need to acknowledge it, a lot of the work that we are doing in the corporate world, for example, is built on years and years of labor of our activist friends. And I think it's vital to acknowledge the fact that all this work is being built upon it, and it continues to be built upon it, right? So whether it is NGOs who have struggled for years, whether it is activists who came out from the 70s onwards and paved the way for this generation to do the kind of work that it's doing, whether it's the lawyers who fought, everyone, there are so many cases from the 90s onwards. And people remember the 2018 victory, but, there were lawyers who were involved in 2013, 2009, even before that, right? All those struggles. So I don't think of it as oppositional at all. I think of it as a universe in which we all are doing whatever we can, wherever we can. So I situated myself in the corporate world because I could, because I also felt that there was a need for someone like me who is able to, in a sense, shape, shift, and translate. And I felt that my work would be more useful from a corporate world, because even with the toehold that I have, like, I don't have power in the corporate world, honestly. I have influence, right? But I have a toehold of influence. So how can I use that position to put that toe in, kind of widen, open a door, first at Godrej, and then, hopefully in other companies, and say, let's talk about this, let's do this, right? There's no way that I would be successful at doing all of the work that I've been doing, actually, if it was not for my activist friends on the ground who are actually doing the real heavy lifting, if it was not for my academic friends in universities who are questioning, who are pushing, who are countering, who are reflecting. So I think we have to stop thinking of these spaces as oppositional and instead think of them as nodes. What we should also stop thinking of them as silos from which we cannot share, connect, interact, disagree, with each other, but hopefully ultimately be productive in the kind of world building that we want to engage in. And I learned this from Sir Ian McKellen, who, when he visited Bombay some years ago, younger viewers of this podcast might know him as Gandalf and Magneto. For the older listeners, it would be the famous Shakespearean actor, Sir Ian McKellen. And, Ian is Ian for me, Sir Ian for all of y'all, because he's my friend. uh, yeah, Magneto is my friend. All of y'all must be so jealous.
This is why you're so magnetic.
Yes, it rubbed off. And he said that, right? So Ian is also, he started Stonewall, which is this incredible queer rights NGO based out of the UK. And he actually told me, he said, look, Parmesh, I've been doing this for years. And we all, I mean, my realization is that we are all needed, right? We need our activist friends on the streets to push for change. We need people in academia to imagine new worlds and to teach generations of people about these new worlds. But we need people like you and me who can, maybe wear a business suit, go to the businesses, go to the politicians, talk to them and say, look, there's a new world coming. How do we work together? And all. He said, we all need to do our role. And to imagine that, just one of us is going to bring about change would be whatever. Change comes with the whole system. Now, my point in this whole book is to recognize that there's an ecosystem and to recognize that, there are multiple spaces where change is happening, but also to help correct some of those things, right? I think even within the queer movement, right, there is a genuine dissatisfaction that, gay men tend to do a lot of the talking and tend to get a lot of the credit, right? So I've written this book being very conscious that I'm a gay person, that I'm a gay man myself, right? How does one use these projects to create platforms and amplify other voices which are, within the movements, which have been, fundamental in helping shape the movement, but because of structure or so many other things, not been heard, right? So how do we foreground or create platforms to forefront trans voices, lesbian voices, and Dalit voices, so many of these other things is also something that I've been, very, very conscious of in this process.
One of the sort of things that I found profoundly impressive about the work that you've done and Sir Ian has done, I can't call him Ian, that Sir Ian has done, and almost all the people whose stories you've related in your book have done comes from sort of a common, bypasses a common complaint that I often have about how liberals in India have approached, their idea of India, where, one of the themes which is almost a cliche on this podcast, which I'll often ask guests when I'm talking about political philosophy and so on, is what we seem to have done in 1950 is a bunch of liberal elites imposed relatively liberal constitution, not as liberal as I'd like, but a relatively liberal constitution on an illiberal society. And but we couldn't seed those ideas within society itself. And what has happened today is that if you look at our politics, our politics has caught up with our culture. Andrew Breitbart once said that politics is downstream of culture. So it kind of strikes me that if you want to affect true change, it's difficult to do it from the top down. In fact, it simply will not work. It has to go the other way. And that's much harder. It's much easier to try to get the state to do things in a top-down way. It's far harder to get into the culture, because then it takes years, if not decades, for these ideas to sort of percolate through, because you want the culture to change. You want, LGBTQ people to be accepted, not because there is a law which says you shall not discriminate, but because people accept it from their hearts. And I think, one of the things that does make me hopeful, despite the way our politics is going, is that, to paraphrase Martin Luther King, the arc of history seems to be bending towards inclusion, in the sense that, I remember when in 2018, when the judgment happened where 377 was outlawed once again, and I thought to myself that if this had happened in 1988, there would be so many voices raised against it. And, I can't recall, apart from people on the fringes, anybody really against that sort of wonderful judgment in 2018. So on the one hand, it seems to me that for a variety of reasons, maybe openness to global influences and social media and all that, society has changed and become more tolerant and all of that, at least in these specific contexts. But the other sort of interesting aspect that I really liked and admired is that, what you're trying to do in your case in the context of corporates, but also other contexts like you do with the Godrej Culture Lab, is bring this bottom-up change in the culture. Is this something that you've kind of thought about? Was there a conscious understanding that this is how we need to do it, or did things just happen along the way?
Yeah, so I try and do both. And, I don't know how much of, say, the work through the lab is bottoms up because, there's so much. We're just one of the multiple spaces in, Mumbai and then the country, which hosts different kinds of conversations. It's certainly an attempt to platform and amplify a range of voices which are all talking about contemporary India. And over the years, I think we've, based on different themes, I think we've been able to showcase, incredible individuals through a range of different formats as well. Physical, mostly physical events, but now shifting to online. So yeah, that's been very, very good. But I also think that it is a combination. Again, it's not because I think at least in the corporate world, I'm very impatient and I can't wait for bottoms up change to happen. So I strongly recommend in the corporate world, and given how, hierarchical Indian society is in terms of, whether government, whether corporations, etc., I actually say, if you can influence people at the top, and until the cultural, I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on the cultural change and, help change societal attitudes, values, etc. towards, but as you rightly said, that's a long-term project. Until then, it would really help if we had the chairperson, the chief minister, etc., say, look, this matters. I want to do this. Here's how we're going to do it. I want a report in 1 year or whatever. India also really works like that. And one of the reasons that, say, Godrej has been maybe more successful in the small journey that we've taken so far than other companies is at Godrej, it was Nisa Godrej from the Godrej family, chairperson, saying, inclusion matters to us. Here is what we're going to do. I want to create a Godrej which is more inclusive. Make it happen. So everyone across the group, right, would read this message and say, okay, the chairperson from the family, this is what, let's think about this, right? In so many other companies, it might be someone really well-meaning from HR driving it through diversity and inclusion. It might not have the same impact. So I think we have to do which is why in states, right? And we talk about some of the progressive states in India, right? In Kerala, in Chhattisgarh, the chief ministers have gone on record to say that, they care about LGBTQ inclusion. They have given scholarships to trans people. They have supported so many events and so on. The bureaucracy will change, when that clear direction comes, right? And then that change percolates as well. So I actually think it's a combination of both. I think for immediate effect, it's actually more timely and it's just more clever to work with a top-down approach. But certainly the long-term project has to be, a long-drawn attempt at socio-cultural change through various things, through education, through movies, through role modeling, and, so on. That takes time. And, as I write in the book, I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait. We waited for 7 decades after independence. My queer brothers and sisters have waited for 7 decades to be decriminalized. And having said that as well, there's no equality as such, right? Because we may have had this 2018 verdict, but we've also had at the same time, and people tend to forget that we had a 2014 Nalsa judgment, which was visionary in terms of the scope of rights it offered our trans citizens of this country, which has led to actually a not so sensitive Trans Act, which has recently been followed, right? So there's so much we need to change the Trans Act, hopefully soon, so that the spirit of the Nalsa judgment can live in the Trans Act, on multiple fronts. We need to convert the non-criminality which is what Section 377 going away has offered us, into real equality on multiple fronts, which is comprehensive anti-discrimination laws in our country, which we don't have, other kinds of equality laws. I write in the book about how, at least for me personally, I would love to be married to my partner. I would love to frame my marriage certificate on the wall and do all those kind of, maybe it's very silly. So many of my friends critique me. They say, you're doing heteronormative mimicry. But, I want the right to do that if I choose. Na? I mean, it's not heteronormative mimicry. For me, it's Karan Johar and Yash Chopra obsessed, Bollywood film obsessed mimicry. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, what to do? I blame Shah Rukh for all my romantic constructs. But why shouldn't we have, why shouldn't I have the rights to be as silly and stupid as everyone else if, in doing all of these things, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do. And in that work, I think a top-down approach, I would like both. I would like people in positions of power saying this matters and let's do it, as well as cultural change.
No, I buy that, both together can be helpful and it's not either or. But I was actually interpreting the work that you do with corporate leaders, like, Nisa Godrej doing the things that she does, as in a sense bottom up, because it's not imposed by the state saying do this. It is voluntary action. It's someone who runs a company herself saying that, this is the sort of culture I would like in my company and this is what I'll do for it. So in that sense, because it's voluntary action and not imposed by the state, I was referring to that as bottom up. I can see how in through another prism, it can seem as top down in the context of what is happening within the company. And my next question kind of comes there that, as you've sort of detailed through your book, it's, you've done pioneering work with Godrej and, various other companies have also kind of been doing great work from, IBM to Cummins to, various other people. Now the question is that there was also that sort of disturbing example of that person in charge of diversity and inclusion at Tech Mahindra, who was, bigoted towards a gay employee. And when that came out, of course, when it became a big thing on Twitter, she was fired and an inquiry was done and all of that. And as you point out, the people who actually, Anand Mahindra, who actually runs the company, is extremely enlightened that way, but that doesn't necessarily seep through the culture. And this is a question that you've sort of raised yourself at that point where you talk about this incident, that it's okay to have enlightened people at the top make these rules and make these whatever, but it's also, that doesn't necessarily mean that the culture down below changes and the homophobia goes away. Whereas I would imagine if you're working in a company and you have rules that forbid you from doing certain things, you will have to follow those rules and you'll internalize them and the culture will change a bit. But at the same time, you're bringing in these sort of normalized attitude towards certain kinds of people, and those are not going to disappear. Those will manifest in other ways. And, I know your thoughts on this are still evolving as you raise it as a question in the book. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you've thought on this? Have there been moments where you felt despair and said that, even if we do all this work, people are what they are? Or are you generally hopeful because, your book is full of such stories of hope and such stories of inclusion? What's your sort of overall take on this?
I feel despair every day. Every day I fluctuate between hope and despair all the time. If I end on hope 51% of the time and despair 49%, I'm fine. My thoughts on this are, I think what Tech Mahindra did ultimately was very good. Because I think they role modeled what, in that sense, in terms of when the issue comes out, how you respond. I thought the response was amazing. And it also sent a strong message throughout, right? Ki we will not tolerate this at all. And in fact, Tech Mahindra has since then, in another part of the book, I talk about how they've launched, same-sex partnership benefits and so many other things. So since then, they've gone on a great learning journey, which is great. So was it good for the individual who went through this? Of course not. I'm in touch with him and he has still been traumatized with that. And that is what I talk about in the chapter, right? I say these are real people. Even if you take all the steps after something has been found, it's very, very hard, right? That person has suffered for all these years. I think this is only going to become less and less if companies role model this kind of behavior, right? So I mean, I think it would be very naive to imagine that just because you have policies and you have senior people who say this is the kind of world we want to create, we're not going to have people, who are going to be bigoted. But which is why then you need to act, right? You need to translate the intent of your policies into action. If you are saying we don't discriminate, then when someone discriminates, how do you act? Because everyone else is watching, right? All the thousands of employees at Tech Mahindra were watching. They were like, discrimination happened. Look what happened. The CEO tweeted, Anand Mahindra tweeted, inquiry was made, that person was fired. Okay. Which means that rights matter here. Which means that tomorrow, if I have some issue that I go to them with, they will take me seriously, right? And everyone else outside was also watching. They said, look, here's a company. Mistakes happen everywhere. This thing has happened here. They've acted in this way. So I think it's how you behave at these moments also that matters. And when you can role model more and more of this, saying that we have a zero tolerance policy, it's very clear how we expect you to behave. And I've given there's been so many other cases as well in the book, right? I talk about, say, maybe a community business where Sandeep goes through, and Sandeep has a boss who's like, who makes a joke about, when Sandeep says, I'm getting married to my partner, the insensitive boss says, why are you, number 9 or something? And then Sandeep raises the complaint. Now, this was a comment, and then the company here sends that boss for sensitivity training. And, the boss comes back and says, I'm sorry, I made that comment. I didn't realize. And they go through that sensitivity training, right? So I think it's important to respond at this time, right? And to say that as an organization, we are setting these policies, we are investing in a culture of training our employees. And if mistakes happen, here is how we are going to act on them. I think the more and more you role model this good behavior, the less you have chances of these incidents happening. Another interesting case study is Kochi Metro, right? Which is not about discrimination, but about the fact that, this is an evolving journey. So Kochi Metro takes a great step of saying we want to we want to hire trans people, which is incredible. A lot of trans people are hired, but then many of them leave. Not because Kochi Metro is necessarily a discriminating organization, but because they're unable to find houses, because people don't want to rent, homes to trans people. And so it's very hard for them to arrive at work, to stay close to office and to arrive at work, etc. Right? So as I write in the book, organizations have to think through some of these things. Now, Kochi Metro understood, relearned, and I believe right now when it hires trans people, it goes a little extra mile in helping them either as a guarantee in terms of, when they're looking for houses in terms of landlords and saying, we will serve as a guarantor or so on, but going that extra mile. So I think this is iterative. There's enough examples also to show of how companies and, Kochi Metro is not a company. It's a state organization are learning on the way and learning how to, act decently and to be good. So that gives me hope in that sense. Yeah.
In your book, there's also the great example of the Lalit and how they have a policy of sort of hiring more and more trans employees. And yeah, I mean that, one of the lessons perhaps from the book is that how incentives can also sort of shape culture. As I keep saying in my economisty, jargony way, we'll take a quick commercial break now. And after we come back, we'll wrap up your personal journey and we'll start talking about, your work at Godrej and everything that you've been doing in the last 10 years.
Okay.
On the Seen and the Unseen, I often speak about positive sum games. Well, if you want to be surrounded by beauty and you love fine art, I have a win-win proposition for you. Head on over to IndianColors.com. Indian Colors licenses images of fine art from some of the best contemporary artists in India and adapts them to objects of everyday use like tote bags, pouches, and home decor items. You get to surround yourself with the finest modern Indian art at affordable prices, and artists get royalties for every product you buy. Win-win game. The Indian Colors new range is in and includes elegant yet comfortable dresses for women and casual shirts for men with standout motifs by artists such as Tanmoy Samanta, Manisha Gera Baswari, Shruti Nelson, Pradeep Mishra and Jaideep Mehrotra. Stay home but dress smart. And if you're missing your friends in these lockdown days, worry not. You can show them you're thinking of them by buying gifts for them from Indian Colors. Corporate gifting is also available. So head on over to indiancolors.com, that's colors with an OU, and make art a part of your life. And hey, for a 15% discount, use the code UNSEEN. That's right, UNSEEN for 15% off at indiancolors.com. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Parmesh Shahani on his wonderful book, Queeristan, which, is eye-opening, and there is so much to learn there, even for someone who thinks that, they know the subject very well. So, let's kind of get back to your sort of personal journey. And, one of the delightful things that struck me about your preface or your prologue or, the start of your book was when, you point out how your dad got to know of your being gay through the BBC. That was pretty fascinating. Tell me a bit about that, and how did he react, and how did your parents kind of deal with it?
Yeah, so it was, I was at MIT. I had just organized a big South Asian LGBTQ film festival over there. It was very hard because in the middle of my, academic semester, I thought, one must do this. And so it was the first time that something like this was happening on the East Coast, because on the West Coast there was, say, Tricone and a lot of, queer stuff happening. But, Boston had Masala, which was the South Asian LGBTQ organization, but they'd never really, and, New York had Salga and all, but they never attempted something like, like a queer festival of this nature before. So it was newsworthy. And a BBC journalist called me and they talked to me about it, and I happily gave the interview. And the BBC chose to put it up on their front page, on their homepage, when the interview ran. And it was interesting because the top story was Pervez Musharraf and Pervez Musharraf's picture, who at that time was president of Pakistan. And then below that was this article with my photo saying, South Asian gays find US voice. And it was very interesting because, I started getting calls from people all around the world saying, BBC is saying that you're gay and you're doing all of this. And my cousin actually called me from Bombay. She's like, listen, because I was out to my mom, but I wasn't out to my dad at that time. And so she was like, it's not going to be fun if someone forwards this to your dad. I think you should call him. So I called him and I had to tell him a bunch of things. I said, look, I'm gay. And the whole world knows about it because the BBC did a story. So, and, the BBC is right. At least in those days, it used to be right. It was known for its accuracy. Even now, I suppose. So it's like, it's on the BBC. It's true. And he had to react at that, right? So not only did he have to deal with the fact that his son was gay, he had to deal with the fact that it was now a world story. Given that, I think it took him some time because he reacted more like a typical Indian parent than my mom, because he was like, oh, what will the world, as the world knows now already, no, darling. He was like, oh, I wanted grandchildren. I was like, we can get grandchildren. Don't worry. It's like, yeah, I thought you would get married. I was like, we'll get married. It'll just be a guy. And so he was like, that's not what I had in mind. I was like, yeah, life is sometimes like that. And over time, he has accepted. Now with Queeristan out, he forwards me articles that he's read about it. And he's like, I saw your show with Faye D'Souza. You spoke well, or things like that, right? So it's been a journey. With my mom, it was immediate. It was kind of underwhelming because I told my mom, I think I'm gay. And she was like, you think or you're sure? And I was like, I'm sure I'm gay. And she was like, okay, what should we have for dinner? And that was really the conversation with her. And I kind of felt thoda sa cheated because I had made all these but you don't understand, but this, but that. I made all these dialogues in my head, which I couldn't use. And then I told her, I said, why aren't you having any drama? And she was like, what is there to have drama? And she was like refreshingly cool about it.
Cooker में से चना किसने निकाला?
Correct, completely.
Yeah, if they are listening to this, hello, uncle and auntie. And let's kind of now move on. You're at MIT. You've even set up a sort of a kind of a forum there. You're considering helping to run that while you're there. And then you decide to come back to India and join the corporate life. So how did that sort of shift happen?
That was all because of, Shah Rukh Khan, I think, has ruined my life. First with those ideas of love, romance. I'm also doing, Arms Ahead, and Yash Chopra first because of, Chandni and that rooftop helicopter rose petals. I began to think, I also want like that only. These days, if the husband smiles at me after waking up, I feel happy. But my ideas of romance and everything. I think Bollywood, I'm super Bollywood influenced. So multiple things. Actually, I saw Swades. I think a lot of people who came back at that time, Shah Rukh, Ashutosh, we could have been living nicely in Seattle. You made us come back. I would have had a nice house with a picket fence and maybe an exotic foreign husband. No, I saw Swades. It was a bunch of things that had happened. I'd finished my thesis. I was very tired. I was working on this, MIT think tank that I'd set up with Henry Jenkins, my professor. I was enjoying that. I was interviewing because I did want to, stay back. I was in a relationship. I was in a committed relationship. And my partner at that time was finishing his PhD at MIT. So I did want to stay on in America. But the kind of job offers I was getting were from Microsoft, and they were very nice. But, I'd studied as I'd studied as a humanist, and the kind of offers I was getting were to help market Windows and things like that. And it was very good money, but I kind of didn't see how my background and my humanities training would be of any use there. So I was thinking these things through, and then a bunch of things happened. I saw Swades and I was like, no, I think I should use this. I should come back to India and see what I can do with these different things that one has learned. And I then happened to meet, say, Anand and Anuradha in Boston who were visiting, and they were like, listen, now that you're done or whatever, if you want to come and work at Mahindra. There's lots that one can do. So it was a combination of both of those things. The fact that there was a blank kind of canvas waiting for me at Mahindra, but plus I'd seen Swades. I think if I had had that conversation without seeing Swades, I would have said, yeah, fine, but I want to be here only. If I'd seen Swades and not met them, then where was the opportunity? So I think it was everything. There are days when I'm grateful I came back. There are days when I feel that I could have been a nice foreign NRI gay person coming once every year or whatever for weddings. But chalo. So ho gaya, jo ho gaya, wo ho gaya. Now I'm here.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should ascribe so much credit to Shah Rukh Khan because, one of the quotes I really liked in your book was about how your friend Ian, Sir Ian to the rest of us, Sir Ian McKellen, says that, once he came out as gay, the nature of his acting changed, where, you quote him telling you that, coming out was such a relief on all accounts. Everything improved, including my acting. Up until then, my acting was about disguising. After I came out, it became about revelation. Stop quote. And that's such a beautiful quote, and it just made me sort of stop and think about it for a while before I continued reading. And it strikes me that Shah Rukh Khan's acting is just all performative as Bollywood has to be and not about revelation at all. But that sort of aside apart, you also point out in your book about how sort of TED India 2009, where, by the way, just to kind of tell our listeners, TED had their first conference in India, the only conference in India in 2009, and they selected a bunch of India fellows for that, which included, Parmesh and me and, various people you've named, like you named Jasmine Patheja of Blank Noise, who's done such incredible, innovative work. So the bunch of us were all brought together in Mysore for this great TED conference. And even that Mysore at Infosys campus was crazy because I think it was made by Hafiz Contractor. And,
surreal.
it was surreal because all the buildings were based on famous buildings. So somewhere there were White House, somewhere there was the Capitol, somewhere there was the Parthenon and whatever, and it was completely surreal, but also in a sense perhaps an apt place to gather like this, because it was this vast global gathering. But for me, it was just an event where I go, I watch some great talks, which I could even have watched on YouTube, and get to meet, get to hang out with cool people like you. But you've spoken about how it then gave you an impetus to do some of what you did next, especially later with the Godrej Culture Lab. Tell me a little bit about that.
I will, but before that, I want to dispute the fact that Shah Rukh's acting is all performative and not about revelation. As an avowed Shah Rukh fan, I would like to humbly disagree. I think if you have seen Raees, if you have seen Zero, which I loved, I thought it was one of his best films. If you've seen Fan, which was incredible. If you've seen Paheli, if you've seen Kabhi Haan Kabhi Na, if you've seen Chak De, if you've seen The Ranger, if you've seen Swades for that matter, or Raju, or, if you see the range of films that Shah Rukh has done, they are so much about revelation. I think one of the highlights of Shah Rukh is that he makes you feel that you are taking a piece of him. He genuinely gives that to you as well. So I would urge you to relook Shah Rukh with a more loving gaze and discover the joy of Shah Rukh if you can.
He gives you the same piece of him in every film, but we'll agree to disagree for the sake of amity and sort of continue with our conversation. Tell me about TED India.
So sure. So Shah Rukh incidentally also gave a great TED talk in Vancouver. And I must tell you that at that same TED conference, which I happened to be there at Vancouver, there was Elon Musk hanging around on the side. No one cared much. There was Al Gore, was standing behind me in the buffet line, eating very quietly. No one got any, whatever. But for Shah Rukh, the moment the door opened, the moment whatever, there were like thousands of people waiting in Vancouver, screaming their heads out. So, Shah Rukh is Shah Rukh.
I just say that, look, popularity is not a sign of quality. I mean, look at Modi ji.
Well, but as a fan, as a Shah Rukh fan, as an avowed Shah Rukh fan, as a connoisseur of Shah Rukh acting and revelation, sometimes you can have it all. You can have.
My God, I had a similar conversation with Paromita Vohra, our mutual friend. She was on my show, and she's also a Shah Rukh fan. So maybe you guys will make me reconsider. I don't think so, but it's kind of. I'll have to let you have the last word on this as we kind of move ahead.
Yes, okay. I can see you want to move ahead from talking. Shah Rukh, we love you. Okay. Having said that, yes, TED India being selected as a TED India fellow. And I would say off late being a TED senior fellow, because I've just finished that stint, has been quite transformative. I mean, in 2009, TED was not this great global juggernaut. TED has just started putting up talks online. And if you see some of these early talks, it's like, it's not the kind of highly produced TED talk, which has now almost become a meme. Like, oh, you gave a TED talk. Okay, you're uncool. That kind of thing hasn't come. That kind of in those days, it was very, very early. It was very, very new. And this whole format, which Chris and the team have taken to such incredible different directions over the years, was just about being, coming into its own, right? So for me, being at TED was like a brain popping experience. It transformed my life in so many ways, because at that time I had gone back to America. I had left the Mahindra job. I'd started a PhD at UPenn, and I'd chosen to go back to digging deep again. I'd spent some years and my life has been this constant tension between, do I dig deep or do I spread wide? And for those who are listening to the podcast, Amit is grinning right now. No, it's not what you're thinking about, Amit.
I wasn't grinning and I wasn't thinking that at all.
You naughty boy. I was talking about my career. So, at that time, I had gone back to the PhD and I had said, I want to spend some years and working on academic research. But then I came to this, then I got selected for this TED India Fellowship, and then I flew back. And to have a space where you could have science, humanities, medicine, people from NGOs spirituality, love, romance, dance, music, everything kind of come together, fatafat, one after the other in this like, you know, bhelpuri mix of like a brain massage. Kind of, yeah, for me, I'd never seen anything like it. Just being there, witnessing it all, and then witnessing all of us, right? Seeing all these amazing TED India fellows, so many of whom I've like tracked with admiration over the years, right? Someone like a Rikin Gandhi, who was my classmate, who was also with me at MIT, who was training to become, training for NASA, who then left and formed an organization called Digital Green, which works with farmers in rural India, giving them information and technology access and things like that, to young schoolmasters like Babar Ali, who, despite coming from such, underprivileged backgrounds, were creating education alternatives for so many children in their village in Bengal. To like, artists like Sharmishta, to like, so just like really, really, really. So it was both the conference format that I was like, wow, you can have this kind of space, to the people. I was like, array, there are so many cool people in India, all of whom are doing such amazing work. I was like, I don't want to go back and like spend 6 years in doing this PhD. I want to do something TED-like. And that was the idea. Now, I didn't want to do TED India. I didn't want to do a 3-day conference, but I was like, now what I want to do is I want to live in this state of TEDness. Of any given day, I want to be mixing science, design, arts, policy, yevo. I want to like, create this space in India. And what would it mean like to have this broad space like thing? So that was my idea. I went back, I dropped out of the PhD program, which they didn't like, of course, because, I'd filled a seat and now suddenly I was dropping out. And so they said, look, we love you, but don't ever come back here again. And of course, me being the drama queen said, who wants to come back to you, Penn, Eeks? Never, I'll go anywhere but except to y'all. And, we had that kind of showdown. And then I came back and then I started saying, okay, now what to do? How do I create this space? And so I started talking to people from Mahindra, people, I'd encountered, people from the media, and randomly, one of Sandeep Murthy, who's an investor, who runs Lightbox, which is one of the most exciting venture funds in India right now. At that time, he was running Sherpalo and Kleiner, Ram Shriram's fund and Kleiner Perkins, etc. And he was like, you should meet Nisa. I think she'll get you, and y'all are both kind of mad, and maybe y'all will hit it off. And that was that. And that's how I mailed Nisa. We met. We realized that we both, we're very different people, but we connected on so many things. We connected on design thinking, on IDEO. She wanted to know more about LGBTQ issues and my life. And we just started talking. And she's like, look, I don't know what your idea is. I still don't understand what does it mean to create this space and blah, blah, blah. But she's like, I like you. So do you want to work at Godrej? And I was like, Godrej? No, I want to do this. So she's like, why don't you work here? And, if you help me with other things, I'll let you do your idea. And I was like, chalo, theek hai, that's And 10 years later, we're still here. We're still arguing and talking and pushing each other and laughing and imagining. And it's been amazing. Yeah, it's been amazing. Yeah.
And what was your conception of the Culture Lab when you started it? What did you want it to be at that early stage, and how has it then evolved?
So my original conception was very, since I'd been at a place like MIT, it was a mixture of like an institution, which is how the old world thinks of things, right? So first I said maybe it should be a building with people and, like a building, because the model for spaces that I had seen were like cultural centers, like you have to have a building, an office and all. But then the MIT thinking started to kick in, and I was like, why does it need a space and this? And also, Nisa didn't give me much money. She was like, you have one desk in this corner and like, here's little bit of money now. One can do, maybe one could have done one event or 2 events with that money. So I was like, clearly, this is not the kind of thing where we will have buildings and large amounts of people and like things like that. So it can't be like a university center. It has to be something which is shape-shifting, which is packable and you can take it anywhere. So, I mean, because of the nature and the frugality and, these challenges, I think we kind of evolved a new kind of space. So a lab could be an idea space. So we started, and I remember that I'd read something that in a paper that, my mentor Henry Jenkins and my MIT classmate Sam Ford had written about surplus audiences. And they'd done a great white paper on wrestling fans, on professional wrestling fans. And they'd said that, we have to look at this idea of surplus, right? So WWE, this professional wrestling, when they tend to think of who their audience is, they used to think earlier that their audience would be 18 to 35, white male, whatever. But as they did research, they realized, I mean, what is professional wrestling? Like, it's naked men, naked, sweaty men in a ring doing very highly, and, WWE, it's all kind of larger than life performance. So who likes seeing this? They said, a lot of women were seeing this. Because, some women like seeing naked men throwing themselves against each other and jumping like that. So we have not thought of women as our audience, but that's a surplus audience. Then they looked and they said, who else likes seeing this? It's like, gay men like seeing, naked men in chaddis jumping up and down on each other. It's like, oh, gay men is another demographic. So as they did that, they said, okay, so this idea of surplus was very interesting. So I started thinking of that, and I started thinking of, can we create a lab with the surplus of what is already around us? So then I said, okay, I have this, there is at that time we didn't have an auditorium of the size that we do now. There was a small conference room somewhere I said, but chalo, it's being used for office buildings and meetings and all, but if we arrange the chairs like this, it kind of becomes an auditorium. So I don't need to create a building with an auditorium. There is already a thing, right? It's just that when people are not using it, I'll use it. And everything came from that. So the time people tended not to use this conference room kind of auditorium space was at end of the week, 5 p.m. on Fridays. It was easy to get booking at that time. So we said all our events will be at 5 p.m. on Fridays because nobody else was booking it at Godrej at that time. And since then, it's kind of stayed and whatever. So a lot of those decisions came from that. We said, what if we don't have... So then we began to look at permanence, impermanence, again, inspired by, by my friends like Rahul Mehrotra, the architect. And, Rahul, who's now Dean of Graduate Studies at the Harvard, School of Design, has done a lot of work on permanence and impermanence and how do you build for impermanence. And one of his things has been recently, he's been studying the Kumbh Mela as a fantastic site where you honor the earth because it's eco-friendly, because the entire city is built for a short period of time and then it's dismantled and it's taken away. So unlike, say, the waste of building for the Olympics or things like that, right, where so many countries build a whole infrastructure which then is left behind as a dead, as this big white elephant that you don't know what to do with. The Kumbh and all are interesting because they give you this framework of saying you can design for impermanence. What matters is the gathering. What matters is not the building. So I was very informed by things like that. So a lot of the culture labs, whether it's philosophy, whether it's cross-pollination, whether it's the fact that we have a loose, shape-shifting lab, which kind of every few years changes what we do, from an event space, we said we are event space, but we're also resource space. So we started doing white papers that served people more. We've of late said we are an education space. So we started doing fellowships at various levels for college students and things like that. So we said that we are a cultural node and cultural connector. So we started connecting other cultural organizations in the country in interesting ways to come together. So whether it is what we do, how we imagine ourselves as this Jugaru kind of place, which kind of exists through the ephemeral. A lot of our events are about transience. So we started by doing a lot of these pop-up museums. We did a museum of memory as our first pop-up in 2011, which was an old factory that was being demolished the next day. And we filled it for one whole day with art, design, talks, dance, performances. The next day, the bulldozers came and demolished everything. So it was an interesting experience. And everyone who was there, and there were hundreds, if not thousands of people, knew that they were taking part in the happy death day party of that factory. So what does it mean to honor, a space through this kind of solidarity, knowing very well together that tomorrow it won't be there. But what will remain are the moments we create and the digital archive, which is a trace. So a lot of that has kind of informed the work that we do. We're not obsessed with permanence, but we are obsessed with connections, creating connections between, our speakers and performers, or our speakers and our audience, or giving resources and things like that. But it's all, so the influences have been vast and varied, from architecture, from philosophy, from Kenya Hara, who's this incredible Japanese designer. He was the chief designer of Muji, and he did the Nagano Olympics, spoke to me once about emptiness. And, he's known for his minimalism. And I hate minimalism as a design practice. I hate it. I'm a maximalist. I think minimalism is boring as hell. This whole one long gray table with one marigold on the corner. It drives me crazy. I'm like, if you give me a small table, I'll want to keep 100 things on it,
This explains our disagreement on Shahrukh, by the way, because I like minimalism a bit more.
Oh God, eeks. Why be minimalist when you can be maximalist? Anyway, so Kenya Hara, he has built Muji on minimalism. As I was telling you, he's like, he's like, fine. He's like, let's not think of minimalism. He's like, why don't you look at it as emptiness? And he's like, you hate minimalism? Don't. He's like, I design for emptiness. And emptiness is not minimalism. Emptiness is, I give you something that you can fill how you want. So when I'm giving you something that's gray and utilitarian, it is empty. I'm offering it to you. Do what you want. And I thought that was interesting as a way of viewing life, right? How can you design for emptiness so that everyone who goes away takes, fills it with their own perspective? So anyway, the lab philosophy has grown from so many various influences, people who flowed through it, our incredible team members over the years. We've had some brilliant people, mostly young, flow through the lab, come spend some years with the lab. They've gone on to do amazing things. One of our alums is in Spain doing incredible work. Another one left the lab and joined the UN, has been building toilets across the country as part of Swachh Bharat, and then through, a private CSR initiative. Someone else joined the lab. He had trained as a lawyer, joined the lab, discovered so many other things, and is now a fashion stylist at Grazia. So it's been quite amazing. I think the legacy of the lab is just the incredible, people who have spoken at it, collaborated with it, and worked at it. So it's been an interesting journey, but really thinking about some of these things of permanence versus impermanence and so on.
No, and that's so fascinating. I need to sort of think deeper about it and process all of it. It also strikes me that, virtual spaces also by their very nature are impermanent in a way, and they've kind of been, forced upon us now by the circumstances of the lockdown. And it also just struck me when you were speaking about filling emptiness that every time I embark upon recording a conversation like this, what I'm trying to do is fill that emptiness of the space that lies ahead for the 2 or 3 hours that the conversation lasts. I want to now, let's kind of move on to the book, which also sort of describes, how you straddle these two different worlds simultaneously. Like, I was very struck by your phrasing early on in the book, where you speak about how you have a day job plus a gay job. And the gay job, of course, is the sort of advocacy where you get corporates to become more LGBTQ friendly. And, you describe that elsewhere in the book, quote, I am arguing from my unique inside-out position as a corporate person working on LGBTQ issues and my outside-in position as an activist and cultural creator using the corporate world to advance my agenda, stop quote. And this is not just within Godrej. Elsewhere you write, quote, I use every occasion that I can to talk about LGBTQ issues. The Red Ball Music Academy invites me for a talk, I'll queer it. The El Decor India Design ID Summit, you bet. A new Columbia Business School batch is visiting India, time for a gay lecture. The Society for Human Resource Management, pretty obvious what I'll be speaking about. If I am visiting Yale, Brandeis or Harvard or the Edinburgh International Culture Summit at the Scottish Parliament, the Desi rainbow flag flies on foreign soil too. stock quote. And, you mentioned early on at one part when I think, Anand Mahindra offered you a job and you asked him that, does your company have same-sex spousal benefits? And he was like, well, not yet, but, we can do something like that for you. And from that to making this an actual mission, and in my mind it's very much, it feels bottom up to me that you're talking to corporations and getting them to voluntarily sort of put these practices in play. How did this come about? Because it obviously evolved into something that had a sense of a mission about it. Was it like that from the start? And or how did you kind of view it going into Godrej? Did you think that this is something I've got to spend so much time on as you ended up doing?
Yeah, it's very strategic. I mean, even calling it a gay job, I mean, I say it in jest and also to rhyme, but also very much because there is a certain performativity which comes through in the writing in Queeristan, but which also very much comes through in how I choose to present and interact with the world. There is a visibilization that I do, and I do it with intent because it is a form of queering. I do want to queer business in multiple ways, right? One is what would it mean for business to have a queer person, very visibly queer, out there in their midst, right? So I'm queering business with my presence and with my vociferous presence.
What do you mean by visibilization? Sorry.
Because I, just like other straight people talk about, their lives. I mean, I talk in my business meetings. Someone will say, because, people in business don't just talk about work, right? Someone will say, Are, my daughter's school this, now her 10th standard. I'll say, Are, my partner this, my that. And I think for too long, I mean, that's the other thing also, right? Either queer people are closeted, so they don't share, or there aren't, they're not there. So a lot of people don't know what it's like. I mean, and at least Godrej with our senior leaders, everything, I make sure that if someone is talking about straightness, I will make sure that I talk about queerness because it should be as normal for them to listen to what I did on the weekend. I can say my partner and me, we went here, we did this, as it is for me to listen to them about what they did on the weekend. So, I mean, when I say I queer business with my voice and my presence. But also with everything else, with the idea of, what does it mean? So I love wearing bow ties, and I wear bow ties a lot at business meetings, etc. I don't know if it's not this, but like, I think over the years, Godrej has changed to people can wear what they want. And, all the way with me, with my flamboyant bow ties to someone else who may choose not to wear a tie, who may choose to wear jeans and t-shirts, right? So I'd like to think that my presence in terms of being so confident with my dress sense has empowered other people to say, why do we have a formal dress code? Let's all dress the way we want, right? So that's another way of queering business, I suppose. And in so many other ways, right? In terms of just thinking about things, in terms of how can we think differently and so on. Likewise, when I say I have a day job, I have a gay job. The gay job is very much about interjecting this in other companies and talking to at every location, at every space, etc., to widen people's horizons and imagine queerness and inclusion as something that they can do, but also to visibilize it for them that here is this person who's queer, himself. So in that sense, it is very much me. So I'm not inauthentic, but I'm very conscious of the performative aspect of my gayness in that sense. And it is strategic, and I do it with great intent, and I don't leave any space where I can talk about the issues that matter, because I know that because who knows, and that's the thing, right? It might be a summit, it might be something. I do it for multiple reasons. One is to widen people's horizons, open their minds. Secondly, in that audience, there might be a young queer person who is going through doubt, who's thinking, am I the only one? Who's thinking, maybe the world isn't going to get better? Who's thinking all these things? And I want to show that person that here is someone who is working at a company, who is trying to bring about change, and don't worry, it's going to be a better world for you. Don't worry. So one of the other reasons I do it is also to give people this sense of, I'm visibilizing to also give them hope. And this has happened. I write in the book about how I give a lecture at IIM Kozhikode 1 year, and I often do recruitment for Godrej, right? I go and talk about And of course, my half an hour recruitment lecture will be 27 minutes about LGBTQ rights in India and 3 minutes about why they should join Godrej. And that's fine because you give me a stage, I'll talk about LGBTQ inclusion. So I, did this 1 year. And, there was this one girl who stood in the corner and just looked at me and didn't come up. And this often happens. Sometimes students will come up, they'll say, sir, can we take selfie? This was cool, etc. And sometimes people will just like kind of hang out. Next year, I went back again, and this girl came up to me and said, I heard you. It was so, because, I'm lesbian. I was very scared. I'd come to this place. I didn't know if IMK would be a welcoming, inclusive environment, but just hearing you speak and you being not embarrassed at all and you speaking about it so naturally gave me the confidence. I've come out. I'm part of the IMK LGBTQ support group. And, we're going to do such incredible work, right? So one doesn't know how one's presence and when one talks about it, how it can benefit so many others, which is why I think for me, this visibilizing aspect is very, very important.
No, and it's so fascinating that this is like a strategic choice that you made. And I'll take one more tangent, which I promise will be the last tangent because we really ought to get to the meat of the book. But I couldn't help this tangent because it's a subject that's kind of close to my heart. You spoke earlier about how it is not only young people who are addicted to their gadgets, but also, old fogies like us, at least old fogies like me. I don't want to call, offend you by calling you like us. And so I was watching a heck of a lot of TikTok for a while last year, and I found it remarkable because one, obviously we know how the spread of broadband after Jio really took over that space has empowered so many more people with broadband than they otherwise would have had access to. And TikTok was a very fascinating example of cultural expression being enabled by this. I have always felt that whatever we see in mainstream entertainment, including Bollywood, it is either the content is driven by insiders who've been there forever but have regressive views of Indian society, or elite outsiders who've come with notions that don't transplant so easily on Indian soil, as it were, to paraphrase Ambedkar's words in an unusual context, they're top dressing on Indian soil. But what TikTok gave me a sense was that here was, because the means of production and distribution was so democratized, that here was this enormous outpouring of what our culture really was like. And one of the things which I found so heartening was that there was so much gay expression on it, LGBTQ expression on it, to the extent that, when the war between YouTubers and TikTokers erupted, a lot of the pejoratives YouTubers were using were, homophobic pejoratives like, oh, wo to meetha hai, and all of that nonsense. And I found it interesting that I think, and I wonder if you'd agree, that what I found happening on TikTok is that because there were so many LGBTQ people who were expressing these alternate sexualities, and even women expressing, different aspects of femininity than you'd otherwise see in popular culture, it created what, the sociologist Timur Kuran calls a preference cascade, that people watching this no doubt felt empowered by this visualization, as you say, by knowing that there are so many other people who are like me, who share the same tastes as me, and you just had an explosion of content, which is why I feel it's like incredibly tragic and almost heartbreaking that TikTok got banned, more than I would feel about any other app. What are sort of your thoughts on this? And, is this something that, gets spoken about and so on?
Yeah, so I have a whole section in the book on TikTok, actually, which I love, which, comes towards the end. Yeah, I mean, if I wish I knew about cascading preferentiality, I would have used it in the book. But I do want to, if I can just read out that section from the book, which I think explains it wonderfully, right? So this comes after me writing about so many of these TikTok videos with, gay men, either couple, single, etc., that, my partner and me see every morning, at least used to see while having breakfast together. And, and this is how I end that section. I read this TikTok co-option by queer Indian youth as a form of mimicry and hybridity, to use two popular terms from the cultural theorist Homi Bhabha. I started this chapter by saying that we first need to imagine Queeristan and then live in it. I see the different acts of heteronormative mimicry being performed by the men in the videos as both homage to heteronormative romance as well as the articulation of a radical queer agenda. Over the course of repeated viewing, and because there are so many of these videos being produced and circulated, this performed queerness gets delinked from the heteronormative homage it started off and becomes valid on its own terms. I consider this ubiquitous normalization of queer desires to be super exciting. We are no longer a minuscule minority. Through TikTok, we are showing ourselves and being seen all across India with every right swipe. And that's what I feel, which is why I think it's really tragic that TikTok was banned, but also because there's such a class element to it, right? Because so many of the TikTok superstars come from smaller towns, smaller cities, a range of languages, say versus, for example, Instagram users who tend to be mostly big cities or English speaking and so on, right? It's also an economic cost because so many TikTok, stars and influencers were making money off TikTok in that sense, right? So I think it's quite sad that TikTok is gone as of now. So maybe it will come back, and all the TikTok stars can get back to being fabulous and showing everyone around them the range of queer possibilities that exist across this country.
Yeah, and that class angle is indeed very stark because you and I, having grown up so privileged, have had access to all the platforms we would want to have access to, and it just strikes me that TikTok just gave a platform to people who never had any platform of any kind, not just in terms of performing themselves, but just watching entertainment by people like themselves, and then perhaps being inspired to do stuff of their own, which was fantastic. Getting back to your day job plus gay job, as it were, you've also, at one point in your book, you had a couple of lines where you talk about all the talks. You go from talk to talk to talk, and you're doing all of that with a sense of mission. And at one point, you write, not all of these talks are easy to do, and I sometimes find it tedious to repeat myself or answer really basic questions. But what to do? Diversity line में ये सब करना पड़ता है. Stop quote. And I found this very charming, by the way, this interjection of your own voice, which is true to you and makes a book feel like, someone close to you is sitting and talking to you rather than you're reading some boring academic tract. But how hard was what was that journey like? I mean, I would imagine perhaps in a simplistic way that people are much more open now than they might have been when, you began 10 years ago.
No, yeah.
But
no.
Really?
No, people are still, it's still very early days. It's still really early days. Still, I will, and I'm happy that they are calling me and I'm very happy to go and I'm happy to talk. Still, it'll be a sea of, last year I did Organization of Pharmaceutical Producing Industries, etc. OPPI. It's the largest pharma body in the country, right? So incredible. And I'm glad that they were doing a diversity day. They had so many, but I go on stage. And one of the other things that I do is if I'm giving a talk and they say, I make sure that the other people on the panel are different because, I'm very conscious. I don't want them to think the LGBT means having 3 gay men. So I just, make sure I said, do you have someone who's lesbian, bi? Do you have a trans person? I'm happy with a well-meaning ally and things like that. But I really want you to even visually show, when you are showing us people who are thinking of diversity for the first time, it can't be cis gay men. You need to have a range of people, even visibly, to show people, right? And I think people are understanding this more and more. That, when you talk about diversity, it has to be people speaking up for ourselves, right? So this was, again, this particular thing, it was me, Naina, who's a trans woman from Bangalore, who's a friend who's in the book, Neelam Jain, who runs an incredible Periphery, which is an enterprise that places trans people and so on. And the 3 of us on stage, and we see the sea of blue suits. And it's literally like 200 men in the room, all wearing blue suits or like shirts and pants, and maybe like 4 or 5 women in saris, conspicuous, and they're on the sides. They're the organizers. And it's so interesting, right? It's so interesting because, and there are glass ceilings, right, in corporate India, because if you look, even now in so many companies, Entry level will be 50-50 now, because more and more companies, even basic gender, right, will say ki we need to hire more women. But by the time you reach senior leadership, it's 5%, 8%, 10%, and every level women drop off, either due to marriage, or then so many women drop off after, having a child and things like that. And by the time you reach top management, it's a sea of men in blue suits. And
In fact,
yeah,
I had an episode with the amazing Namita Bhandare
correct.
on how women's participation in the workforce has actually gone down over the
Yeah,
last 15
yeah,
years, which is just mind blowing to me.
yeah. And needless to say that when you have a room full of men in blue suits, there will be one or two silly questions. So I answer them with love and humor. There's no other way. And with empathy, and I try and like personalize it, right? So with a lot of people, I can understand there is so much ignorance. So I say just ask, even if it's a bad question. It's better you ask and we can answer you than you don't ask and you have this misguided assumption. I get lots of silly questions ranging all the way from if we offer this basic stuff, right? So I mean, now more and more progressive companies are offering gender affirmation surgery to their employees. They're not offering anything extra. It's just that, say, if you were working at Godrej and your health insurance would be 5 lakhs or whatever, if you happen to transition, you can use your health insurance coverage of that same amount to transition. Nothing the company has to do. They're paying the same premium for you as everyone else. Just that your insurer will have to cover that. And most insurers across the country are understanding and covering it, because it's, when you do a group insurance, you pay a group premium. And whether they use it for a heart attack or an accident or this, it doesn't matter to the insurance. They charge your premium based on how many people in the group they think will avail of it or whatever, right? So still, I mean, and more companies are offering gender affirmation, but you will still hear there'll be someone who will say, Arey, but if I offer this, what if so many trans people join me just to do the surgery and then they leave, And then you have to explain to them, ki Baba, first of all, it's not like eating an ice cream or going to the movie or whatever. It's not like, chalo, let's transition. It's a process. It takes time. You have to go through so many evaluations. A doctor has to certify that you're ready to transition. You have to begin hormones. Then you do the surgery. It takes a lot of time. Anyone who wants to transition would be serious about it, would be uncomfortable living in a body different from the one that they feel and so on. So it's a long process. No one is going to join you just to avail of the benefit and then leave. In fact, it would be the contrary. They would join you. They would feel happy that you are offering them this benefit, which is so important to them, and it would probably make them more loyal. So think about it as you would think about, say, maternity leave, right? Now it is a norm for you to give 6 months maternity leave, right? You don't say, oh, someone will join me, become pregnant, and then leave. No. You've understood that maternity is something, and you can't be equal in this, because as far as we know right now, men are not able to carry babies. So it's something which, that you have to offer your women employees, right? You don't think, you stop thinking, I don't know if anyone thought, will someone join me, take 6 months maternity leave and then leave. But so earlier, when I was younger, I would get maybe irritable and angry and say, what rubbish. Now it's just extreme patience. I understand that so many of these questions might come out of ignorance. I don't think it's willful malice or homophobia at times. I think I like to give people the benefit of doubt. Maybe they don't know. So then I explain to them patiently, things like that. Or I personalize it for them. Like when people say, when did you know you were gay? I say, when did you know you were straight? And they're like, I say, same, no? I mean, they're like, it often helps with people to say, think about this. What if your child was queer? Would you be thinking like this? Wouldn't you like your child to go to a school and college in which they were respected and not treated differently? Remember that the queer people who are coming and working for us are also someone else's children. So if you don't want your child to be treated differently somewhere else, should you be treating? So I think a lot of times you have to kind of use different methods in getting the message across. Is it tiring? Yes. Is it tedious? Yes. One of the reasons I wrote this book was also so that I can tell people, just read the book now and then ask questions later, because anything that can be answered by the book, please don't ask me.
Yeah, that can make you very unpopular because one of the things that I have been warned not to say to my friends when we are discussing something is, "Hey, just listen to that episode." So, but no, I think the book is kind of a great service to all of us, and I found a couple of terms that you've used in your book, concepts rather, extremely fascinating, and I'd like you to sort of go over them for our listeners. One of them is jugaad resistance.
Yeah.
I know what is jugaad and I know what is resistance. Tell me about jugaad
So
resistance.
the term that I use for my resourceful way of bringing about change by placing myself within the system. Because I preface that by saying ki, I have a lot of friends who are in academia and activism who think I'm a sellout or who don't like that I'm in the corporate world. And they say, likewise, I have a lot of friends in the corporate world who are very skeptical of people who are activists, right? They'll say, "Arey, those chola walas, or arey, those this, or arey, those that," or like, academics or whatever, right? So I see a lot of distrust. But the point is, they're all my friends and they're all incredible and they're all doing amazing work. So, I think of jugaad resistance as like this thing that I do, which is, am I okay with the status quo? No. Do I want to resist and create a better world, a better, post-pandemic, a better new normal, a more inclusive new normal, all of that? Yes. I have chosen to locate myself within the system. But within the system, how can I resist? How can I kind of keep the door open and kind of have this build spaces for conversations in which, people from these multiple silos can hang out and maybe help each other? That is my jugaad. So it's this kind of micro revolutions of change by placing oneself within the system. One drawback of that is that everyone could dislike you. Like, your corporate world would not trust you because they think, at heart you're an activist, an academic, and activists and academics might not like you because they think you're from the system. But I found, thankfully, that the contrary is true. I think if you tell everyone very honestly, this is who I am, this is where I'm from, darlings, this is what I want to do, they appreciate the honesty. And thankfully, that's what I found over the past 10 years at least. That people appreciate that I'm transparent. I'm saying, look, I'm not saying anything more. I'm saying, this is me. I placed myself here. Here's what I want to do. Let's try and do this together. Does it have limitations? Sure. I mean, that's which I acknowledge, right? I even acknowledge in the book that I'm being permitted to do all of this. I'm being allowed to do all of this. And any given time, given that I operate within, a framework, a structure, an institution or a job, whatever, it could be found not useful. It could be shut down. So I understand that I am at the mercy of, larger structural forces at play. And I operate very much from this position of structural inequality, saying that I know this is a system in which we work. I know that there is maybe a toehold that one has. How can one use this toehold to maybe make the world better is what I'm trying to do in the book.
And let's take a quick commercial break now, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about your book. And I promise I won't hold you up too much after that. There will be no more tangential digressions, as I am wont to indulge in. So see you in a minute.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Vivek Kaul.
And I'm Amit Varma, here to tell you about a new weekly podcast that Vivek and I have launched called Econ Central.
In Econ Central, we will help you make sense of the economic news of the last week, and we'll also try to explain complex subjects in a simple language.
We will also take events outside the world of economics, like from politics, sports, literature, and explain them through the lens of economic thinking.
Why is the stock market going up when the economy is going down? What's the deal with high petrol prices? Should we boycott Chinese goods?
What does free speech have to do with incentives? Why are the roving bandits of Uttar Pradesh in competition with the biggest protection racket out there, the Indian state?
All this and more in our new weekly podcast, Econ Central.
Econ Central launched a few weeks ago and is free on all podcast apps. You can browse our archives at econcentral.in.
Econ Central. You have an incentive to listen.
Don't forget the URL, econcentral.in. Welcome back to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Parmesh Shahani about his amazing book, Queeristan, and indeed the journey that sort of led him to your book. Another phrase that really fascinated me in your book and got me to, just stop reading and think about it for a bit was the phrase cultural acupuncture. Tell me a bit about this.
So it's a phrase that I've borrowed from the Harry Potter Alliance, which is incredible, which is, Andrew Slack and the others founded it. And it's a phrase that actually talks about, using the framework of, popular culture to bring about social change. So imagining the real world as as one of these popular culture spaces. To imagine the real world as, as a Star Wars universe or as this Harry Potter universe. What would it mean for young people to create Dumbledore's army and bring about this change, right? So there are so many young people across young people across the world who are saying, can we create a Dumbledore's army to petition for trans rights or to petition for a trans washroom in our school or college, right? So using this popular imagination, and a lot of young people are doing that. In the recent Hong Kong protests, last year, the Bruce Lee's, still like water imagery was used a lot. And Henry Jenkins, my guru, taught me about this phrase when he came to India. We hosted him, he visited us. And I kind of liked it. I use it in a different context. I use it, when I use it in the book, I honor the origin of the phrase and I honor the Harry Potter Alliance from where it came, but I use it more to describe the kind of experiments that I am doing. So I told you earlier in the interview that, why do I think top-down approach might be good? Because I think you need to know where to press. You need to know where to push to bring about that change, right? And that's what acupuncture is. You put the needle in at the right place, the pain goes away or whatever. And often you do it because you don't have resources to press everywhere. You have a finite number of things that you do. You need to find out where to make that change. So I use it to talk about the various points that I have pressed both within Godrej and outside, within Godrej through the lab, but also through the other kinds of influence that I wield, whether it is with senior leaders, whether it is with, helping curate things like the Leadership Forum, which is a meeting of senior leaders, or whether it has been in utilizing the Godrej platform to talk about change to other companies and other organizations. So I use it to describe my method of bringing about change by pressing at the right notes. And both these phrases come about early in the book because I really want to give readers a sense of what I've been trying to do, but also leave them with a template because, I think of this book very much as my legacy. And for all the young people who are reading it, I want them to read it and say, acha, maybe we can do this, right? Because the people reading it can be, maybe some of them are in college, maybe some of them are working. I want them to use this as a method and say, okay, so, Parmesh could do this. Maybe we can go to our principal and say, what about this, right? Or maybe we can tell, and it's already happening. Like, because Godrej has been talking about this and doing this, so many young HR people I meet tell me, we told our boss, look, Godrej is doing this. And also they said, okay, if Godrej is doing this, we can also. So, they are using this in a way to kind of get the permissions ready to bring about the changes that they want to bring about. So
another phrase in the book that I was struck by and that spoke to me was circulatory queerness. And at one point you speak about the many notions of the self, and I want to read that part out as well, where you say, in India, everything is inextricably tied to the idea of family and community, and maybe that is where we can locate the hyphenation, and you mean between Indian and queer. And then you continue, quote, this Western post-enlightenment idea of the self that needs to be found, that we need to be the best version of ourselves, that life is a journey of discovering and then polishing ourselves, is not so useful to us in India. Here we are many selves and there is no one self, and each of our selves is conditional and contextual, and as we spend our lives navigating these multiple selves, it is important for workspaces to become crucibles of identity formation of some kind. Stop quote. And later on you elaborate on what it means when you say workplaces should become crucibles of identity formation, which was again a sort of a new thought to me, where you talk about how you spoke to an audience of Franklin Templeton employees in Mumbai, and you address the HR managers and you said that, think about who your employees are. Quote someone who has been writing exams their whole life. Maybe they did well in class 10 and then in class 12 and then so on. You sort of line them all up, GE, IIT, MBA, IIM, whatever. And then you write, quote, when these young employees come into your system, I told my Franklin Templeton audience, they are not fully developed. They know how to mug up, write exams and pass tests. They often sacrificed a lot in their quest to emerge from the narrow end of the funnel into your organization, and this includes sacrificing thinking of things such as their own identity or what makes them happy or gives them purpose in life. Your workspace needs to welcome them to explore their multiple selves. You need to reassure them that it is okay to be who they are here, that they can engage with the identities that they often tend to suppress at home. As a consequence, an Indian corporate structure for an Indian LGBTQ person must be a space for reconciliation. Stop quote. And this is a fascinating message, and it's also sort of a fascinating message in the sense that I think many companies, when you talk about LGBTQ rights, would respond to it from a perspective of, okay, it makes sense, we should not discriminate against them. But what you are saying here is that, no, that is not enough, that there is more that you need to do. So expand a little bit on that kind of thinking and how receptive have corporates been to it?
I think corporates have been incredibly receptive because this is also linking to another theme in the book, which is all about family, right? So large parts of the book are about personal families, then families of choice, right? Personal families when your own parents accept you. Families of choice are the families that you create. So hijra households are often families of choice, where you create family-like structures to either compensate for or to supplement, the love that you get from your birth families, right? And then I actually say that workplaces have to act like families. So I think it is very Indian in this sense of saying that your workplace has to be a space for reconciliation, because in so many other countries, you come out first at home and then you go to this workplace as this kind of well-formed or whatever individual. But in India, because of that passage you read out, right? And that is the experience for so many people. Anyway, where we talk about happiness, love, purpose, identity in our houses, forget sex or gender or like any of that, right? Where we talk about these things. So people are really, 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 really need these spaces. And this comes out of the hundreds of talks I've done on college campuses and in offices, right? When people come up to you and they tell you, Ki, it's the first time you're hearing about something like this. Now, if you're 24, 25, it's the first time you're hearing about something like this, I just feel like, how have you spent the rest of your life where you've not thought about something fundamental to who you are? So I think the workplace has to be that. And people understand, because that's the other thing. When people who run companies, people who are in HR departments are also human beings. They've gone through the same process themselves. So when you appeal to that inner humanness, when you say, look, you have families at home, right? You have children at home, you have this. We need to act like good. What does it mean for you to be a good parent to your children at home? Can we not be good parents to our employees? Given that this is the context. I mean, more often than not, I have found people getting it and saying, okay, what would this mean, etc. Right? Then, of course, it's manifested in multiple ways, in policy changes and, and so on. And then there are other challenges that come up. How do you translate all this intent into practice? But I think at a fundamental level, which is why this is such a desi book, when you argue on these terms, it's very hard for people to not understand. And what I've done in the book is I've covered all grounds, right? I've argued on a money term. We all love money. I've said it makes you more money. I've argued on an innovation term. It makes you, and not just me saying it, right? There's data that backs it. I've argued on the talent term. But above all, I'm saying it's in our culture. We need to be like this. We need to act like this. It's who we are, right? So I think I made a pretty watertight case in terms of whichever way you look at it, whatever aspect of your mind or heart you want to be appealed to. I think the book serves that purpose, that, it shows very clearly there's no reason to be not inclusive.
No, and in fact, it kind of, you have a chapter on how queerness is ingrained in our history,
Yeah,
whether we are talking about ancient times or medieval times from a Hindu perspective, or medieval times
yeah,
from, an Islamic perspective, all the way to the modern day. And that kind of leaves me baffled, because then there is that paradox that on the one hand, in our society, we have so much homophobia or often just ignorance, while actually, these modes of behavior and these modes of living have been ingrained in our society for way longer than before, the West came up with words for it,
yeah,
like homosexuality or
correct.
queerness or whatever. And this dichotomy, to me, just thinking aloud, extends much beyond this. It is, I was once chatting with the politician JP Narayan about our society, and I described India as an illiberal society. And my reason for saying that, of course, was the way we treat our women and caste and all of those things. And he pointed out that from another point of view, we are a deeply liberal society because, it's so inclusive in terms of cultural influences. All our food, all our clothing, we take influences from everywhere and
Yeah,
we make them our own. We are a khichdi of our nation.
yeah.
I struggle to wrap my head around this paradox and this dichotomy. What do you think of it?
Uh, I've also struggled to wrap my head around it, which is why one way of writing this book has been to unravel some of this. But my position is very clear that, I've written this book to unravel, but also, the purpose of this book is very much to serve as a manual for change, right? So try to make it like simple and in that sense, very clear, understanding the paradoxes, but simplifying it to a point of look. It's very clear, right? It's in our culture. It's in our family values. Our family values are to include. Plus, there's all these other benefits. It makes you money, it makes you this, it makes you that. So, net, it's good for you, whichever way you look at it. I have not found one reason in my years of research that says that discriminating against someone is bad for you. Here are all the reasons why it's good for you. I've not found any reason why it might be bad for you. And all
Not discriminating, you
not
mean?
discriminating is yeah. People seem to get it. People don't think. I think a lot of the times there's so much noise. People kind of get distracted by the noise, right? So a lot of noise comes, ki, this is against our culture, this is against. But when you say, actually, no, let me show you how it's in our culture. Acha, oh yeah, it is in our culture. You've forgotten it. Which is why I think the work of, whether it's scholars like Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai, or, writers like Devdutt Patnaik, who have popularized mythology so much over the years, right, is so vital, because in a way, Devdutt's in his writing, whether it's very directly in a Shikhandi and other stories they don't tell you, or indirectly in I would say most of Devdutt's other works, is about equality, plurality, inclusiveness, widening one's horizon about the idea of India, and recognizing that a lot of this, right? Even Ruth and Salim write in their same-sex love in India that homophobia is something that was imported into India with the British, and they left 70 years ago. I find it tragic that homophobia remains. I think it's time we sent it off packing as well, and maybe we can get the Kohinoor diamond back. Take your homophobia back and give us back our diamond.
I completely agree with you about giving homophobia away, but the Ghar Wapsi of the Kohinoor diamond, I think, is unnecessary.
I will wear it. I have the perfect setting for it, darling.
Yeah, that would be even more visualization, as you say, for your audiences if you wear the Kohinoor diamond on stage. Let's move on to another fascinating section on your book, the third of 5 parts, where you, in a series of different chapters, you lay out different aspects of the case for inclusion, and you begin it with a chapter on the meta issues. And I really like that, because it struck me that the case for inclusion can be made through 2 different prisms, just as I have always thought about the case for individual freedom. Like, I've always argued that you can make a case for individual freedom on purely moral terms, deontological terms, where you say that it is good in and of itself. You have to respect individual autonomy and consent and all of that. But you can also make the case for individual freedom, whether in the marketplace or the bedroom, from a consequentialist point of view, and say that it's not just better for the individuals involved, but for society as a whole, if all of us are, free to express ourselves and to live our lives as we please, provided we don't infringe the right of others. Now, the case can be made both ways, and it's often a strategic choice that if you're making the case, which way do you make it? And you've spoken about the same sort of dilemma about making the case for inclusion, where you end up making it in, 3 excellent chapters in consequentialist terms by pointing out that companies in their self-interest should be inclusive because, ABC, which we'll discuss. And of course, you also point out the moral case for it. And you discuss a dialogue with a friend of yours who was saying, no, it should only be the moral case. The rest of it may change with fashion and all of that. And I actually agree with you on this and not so much with your friend, because I think that even though individuals, you can appeal to their sense of morality, companies are finally moral beasts. So appealing to that kind of self-interest of this will make us more money, this will get us better employees, is a good case to make, especially since, as you've shared in the book, and I've also spoken about elsewhere, there is so much data to back up the benefits of diversity. But tell me a bit about each of those 3 cases that you make for why corporations should be inclusive and should, go out of their way to be LGBTQ friendly.
Yeah, so I told you earlier, I'm a maximalist. So why do one when you can, why one argument when you can have 4? And I'm glad you're coming to this side of the spectrum, Amit, with minimalistic arguments are pointless. So welcome. I'm happy that over the course of this podcast, I have taken you a little bit into excess. So I think, and that initial thing is very important, right? Because this is also this is it's a moral dilemma for inclusion advocates all over the world, right? Saying that it's deeply personal. Queer people are 4 to 6% of the population, but even morally, even if there's just one queer person in the world, it should be inclusive. And if you base it on business and so on, then you are, in a sense, are you diminishing the moral case for it and so on? But over the years, people are recognizing that, I've anyway never believed in either or kind of things. I've always been a big advocate of both. So I think, this fits in very much with that. And this is what I was seeing on the ground. So I made the case for it on all these terms because I was seeing all these terms play themselves out on the ground, right? There is a clear moral case for inclusion, which I've laid out from a human rights or just from whatever, a decency perspective. It's a no-brainer. Should we be decent to everyone and treat everyone the same? Of course. And how novel and radical that I have to have a whole chapter in the book telling people why decency is a good thing. But there you have it. We do. Having said that, the other things I thought were very important because, we don't have data out of India as such, but there is enough data coming from other parts of the world that make very direct links between profitability, both a company's profitability and the level of the inclusion, as well as, things like GDP, the economy, and so on. Just to give you some numbers, the market size of India's queer economy is about $200 billion with a B. This is assuming, 4 to 10% of the population is queer. That's a lot of money. Who wants a piece of that queer market? I know I do, working in a company. Certainly so many of your podcast listeners who are corporate people will say, hey, we want a bit of this market. So one way of getting it is by being inclusive, to your queer employees, present and future, to your customers, indicating to your customers that this is what you stand for. And, as we have shown with other companies, you will support it. And there's enough case studies about this, whether it's Subaru in the West or like Lalit Hotels or whatever in India and so on, right? Companies that stand up for what they believe in make more money. And likewise, the World Bank did this incredible report in 2014, which looked at the cost of homophobia. And Lee Badgett, who authored this, has gone on record to say that the number that she initially thought of, which was $32 billion, is the cost of homophobia in India for that year, which was 2012, is a conservative number. Which means, and that year, $32 billion was about 1% of the GDP that year. And so the World Bank and Lee Badgett's case was that if India had been more inclusive that year, they'd have got a GDP bump of 1%. Now that is huge. Which finance minister does not want this GDP bump of 1%, right? I think it would be very prudent for people to understand these studies and the direct links as so many other countries have done, as so many other cities have done, and so on, right? Then the second case is a link between innovation and being inclusive. And this, I mean, it should be a no-brainer. But, when there are people making decisions, when everyone around the table looks the same and sounds the same, it's very hard to be innovative because you are thinking about life from your perspective, right? If there are 10 people around the table working on the design of a sanitary napkin for the future, it's going to be, and they all happen to be, male, it would be very hard. The design would be much better if you widen that to include even one woman in that group, because she'll say, well, being a woman, as someone who might have used this product, can I just tell you this, right? And then your product becomes better, whatever, right? Would it be better if you had two? Yes, of course. Then a range of other, and so on, right? So basic example, but just to say that the more diverse teams you have, and diversity is across various pillars. Gender is one, ability is one. If you have PWDs on your team, you can help imagine better things. If you have people who might be LGBT on your team, it might be better. Caste is an important pillar of diversity in our country as well. And so many other, frameworks, religion, caste, age, so many of these other things, right? Which are different pillars of diversity. And there is enough research that now shows that companies that have more diverse teams innovate better, their products do better in the market, and they have better outcomes, which eventually leads to more money. So even the innovation case is very, very clear. The more innovative you are, the better you will do, the more money you will make.
In fact, I've spoken in past episodes about studies which show that the most important factor in good decision making is not IQ or education or any of those things.
Yeah.
It's diversity.
Yeah.
Because you just have so many different viewpoints coming in that there will be people thinking out of your box, not necessarily out of the box, but out of your box. And it's important to have that for its own sake, which doesn't mean that, you value diversity over any of these other attributes necessarily. But I would say the way I would interpret is that whenever you can choose between two equal candidates, choose the one who will, improve your diversity. And ultimately that affects the bottom line. And as you point out, so many studies have shown that.
And that's what positive discrimination essentially is, right? To say that how can you widen the pool of talent to reflect the world outside, because people, your employees, your customers, other stakeholders are living in this world outside in which they are witnessing diversity. So in any society, 4 to 10% of people are queer. There are disabled people. There are people of color, etc. Why is that diversity not being reflected in workplaces? That's the question, right? And if that diversity was reflected in workplaces, if you had workplaces which are more reflective of the world that we are living in, it would be better. It's not rocket science. It's actually quite simple, right? And this is not true of just a corporate level. It's true of cities and countries. So Richard Florida, has done work now for about 15, 20 years on cities. And he wrote this incredible book called The Rise of the Creative Class some years ago, which made a direct correlation between, cities and their productivity and their output. And he had certain parameters which he looked at that linked a city's competitive index. And one of which was that, is the city more inclusive to LGBTQ people? And since then, the work has expanded to look at countries, to look at regions, and so on. And in every case, it's very, very clear. At a city level, at a region level, at a state level, at a country level, if you are more inclusive, you do better, and you, in every way, including financially, right? So even, say, in the US, right? Other parts of the US might be having recessions. But, certain regions, right, whether it's San Francisco, Palo Alto, New York, etc., are thriving because they have been so inclusive in so many ways. The talent gravitates over there. Talent gravitates. Innovative ideas come from there. Innovative ideas come from there. It benefits the economy and things like that, right? So there are so many countries like Chile who've started Startup Chile programs, welcoming innovative people into their country. Countries like Israel, Chile, and all have made innovation like one of the key things that they want to import talent, because they recognize that the future of their countries is going to be based on the talent that they can attract. And if you want to attract global talent, you have to be that kind of society that global talent will want to gravitate towards, right? So, that's, on innovation on multiple levels. And I also write in the chapter about how we want to preserve our talent. And one of the, say in the IIT petition, for example, in the 2018, hearing, so many of the IIT students had said that, they were considering, so many of their, former IIT graduates had already migrated to countries like Canada, etc., not for anything else, but other that they did not feel comfortable living in India at that time. So my question is, why should our best talent be migrating away to other queer-friendly countries? Why don't we create a queer-friendly environment so that, because we have spent our taxpayer money, into educating all these IIT students. It's our money that's gone into educating them, and they want to leave and go to other parts of the world because those parts are more queer-friendly. Why don't we just create a more queer-friendly environment so our talent can remain here? And then add to the innovation potential and output of our economy. So this bit is a little nationalistic, but I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, we want, so from every perspective that you look at, I mean, the link between innovation and inclusion is very clear. And then finally, I go on into, into talent, into reputation, talking about millennials and Gen Zs, and how in today's world, it is a reputation economy, and how young people really, really want to either buy products from or work at companies that are standing up and doing the right thing. And for them, caring for the environment, caring for, thinking about diversity and inclusion. And, there are a bunch of things which are the right thing. So, I mean, these are the pillars on which I make my argument.
Yeah, the three basic pillars. One is it will directly lead you to profit.
Yeah.
Two is that it will attract innovative people. And as you point out in that chapter on, attracting innovative people, it creates a virtuous cycle, because once you have innovation and inclusion within a company, more and more people will want to work in that place. Not just LGBTQ people, but people who just like that openness and the sort of the innovation that happens from there. I mean, again, personal flashback came here. I remember when I graduated from college in 94, I worked for a year in advertising in Delhi, and then I moved to Bombay to work at Channel V. I just gave up my job and I just landed there. And why? Because I saw so much creativity coming out of there at the time. Like if you remember Quick Gun, Murugan, and so on. And of course, I didn't create anything remotely that creative, which is entirely to do with me and not to do with Channel V. But and later on, I remember when I was working at Cricinfo in the early 2000s, and there was so much great cricket writing that automatically, once you established yourself as a place where there is good writing happening, anybody who wanted to write like that would gravitate towards you. And, we became a magnet for young writing talent, many of whom have gone on to do great writing apart from cricket. So that's a great point. And your third point was about just the reputational benefits that, if you have that warm, fuzzy feeling about a company, or even at an intellectual level, a sense of admiration for what they're doing, you are more likely to buy their products. Like, again, contextualizing this to myself, I remember a few years ago, I went to Costa once and I said something to the waiter and he couldn't hear me. And then I realized that they're hiring, deaf and dumb staff.
Yeah.
And, as a company policy. And immediately then that increases your loyalty to that particular place, because you're like that, wow, this is, and so those knock-on benefits also, are there. Now, let's kind of move on to, the fourth section of your book is a fascinating 5-step guide for what companies can do for, having, now that you've sold them the case that inclusion is good for you. How do they become inclusive? And you've got this guide for that. So can you take us through, some of the points that you've kind of raised in that?
Well, I do want them to buy the book also. So I don't want to take them through so many points that they don't buy the book. But I
briefly. We are running out of time anyway, so we'll cover this briefly.
So all
and
those
then
who are hearing this, I mean, think of this as the tasting menu, not the main course. And the main course is very good. So you have to come.
I think even the subjects that we have discussed, we have just touched the surface of it, and people really have to buy the book to get a full sense of the depth of the arguments and the data presented. So I think that goes without saying. And don't worry about that. My listeners buy books.
Very good. So, I'm so glad. So since you all buy books, you can feel free to buy it in all formats. It's a paper book. There's a Kindle. There's also Audible. So you can buy it in all formats. Now, having told that.
Not just that, buy multiple copies and gift it to people who you think they need to be gifted to.
Yeah, it's bright, it's colorful, it's It's a perfect gift for anything, whichever festival is coming up, gift it.
Though the picture of you in it is like almost besides a bow tie, it's a very boring corporatish picture.
What
Yeah,
to
what
do
is
is
this?
line में ये भी करना पड़ता है ना. I have to look little.
Serious.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, but next edition we'll do something more flamboyant. So just to give you an overview of in terms of the different sections, I mean, in terms of, it starts with basic policies that one can change, right from having an anti-discrimination policy. And I make it very easy. I give you the Godrej. A large part of the book, I'm just giving you. I'm saying, here's what we have at Godrej, copy and paste it, okay? Because a lot of people who are reading it might say, oh, now we don't know how to make one. It's there. Use it. We don't mind. There's no copyright. Use it. So what is an anti-discrimination policy? I tell you. I say you can use this. What does it mean to have, a more comprehensive POSH policy? We put that in. So a lot of policies and benefits. What are benefits? Same-sex partnership benefits. Here is what they are, and this is what we offer. Gender affirmation surgery and benefits. This is what it means. This is, So all the first step is just, having all of this in place. And then I also say, don't have it and do it quietly, right? You're doing this, you must make some noise about it so that people know. Now, having the policies and benefits in place doesn't mean that tomorrow, like hundreds of people will come out and start using it, right? Because people are not closeted because people are closeted because of various things. So you might have the best policies and benefits, but you might not have a culture of inclusion. So people might want to avail of it, but they might be afraid, if I come out, will my boss treat me differently, or will my co-workers, and will my that, right? So you have to supplement your policy and benefits with a whole bunch of other things. And so all those other steps are about these other things. Like, what does it mean to sensitize people within, right? How are the different ways you can sensitize? And I show people, whether through workshops, whether through roundtables, whether through carnivals, what does sensitization mean? How do you go out and actively recruit LGBTQ people? Because now there's an ecosystem. Say you want to be LGBTQ friendly, and you want to say, okay, I'm sure I have queer employees, I'm going to do all of this, but I'd like to attract more queer talent. Now there are consulting companies, there are job fairs, there's so much that you can do, including basic things, like even just signaling. This is what Ali Potia from McKinsey told me. You can put even all your posts on Naukri.com. Even if you just put one rainbow around it, the queer people who are reading it will understand, oh, they're queer friendly. Maybe I can apply or whatever. You don't have to say we are queer friendly. Basic signaling also goes a long way, right? And that's the thing. So it tells you about how you can, participate and create this. There's a specific chapter on all the things that you have to be careful and mindful about when you are reaching out to trans employees, because trans employees have a unique set of needs. And so as a company, you have to be more sensitive. Basic stuff, right? A trans person might have a 10 standard school leaving certificate with one gender and might have transitioned to something else. So you have to tell your HR department, please don't create difficulties and say, but your school leaving certificate says Mr. and now you are Miss and all that. You have to understand and you have to accept, and you have to say, fine, we accept this certificate, we accept this also. Like that, there are so many other things, right? We spoke about Kochi Metro earlier and saying how you might have to help with housing, opening bank accounts, so many other things, right? The other thing is with trans people, often because of systematic discrimination, levels of education might not be so high. So if you're serious about hiring trans people, you might want to do a combination of skill building and training and hiring, which is what, ANZ and so many of these other, banks have done to great success. Working with community organizations, doing a skill building workshop for 6 weeks, and then the 25 trans people who've attended the skill building workshops, the ones that do well get absorbed into the company, and the ones that the company does not want, they are given certificates, and then they have a better chance of working with other companies and so on. So, it's a useful chapter in that sense. So I end by talking about how if you really want to go the whole hog, then you have to really talk about it to the world. Because, I personally don't think I think it's everyone's choice, but I think you shouldn't be a closeted company also. Because in the words of the famous Rakhi Sawant, jo dikhta hai wo bikta hai. So if you are being inclusive, why not tell the world about it and show it to the world and get the love and appreciation that the world will give you for it. So don't be closeted. Talk about it at public forums. visibly support queer culture by sponsoring film festivals, literature festivals, pride marches, whatever it takes. Support your employees when they want to go on things like that. Help community organizations through your CSR in whatever way you can. Just be an out and proud ally, because the love and affection and market share and everything else that you will get in it is far greater than you will put in it. That I can guarantee you. So, it's a multiple step approach. I hope everyone who reads it follows all the steps.
You are the first person on my show to quote Rakhi Sawant as a management guru. That was fascinating. I have two final questions for you. My penultimate question is this, that what we often see in social movements is that sometimes a cause can be hurt by radical fringes, and there is a danger of going too far. For example, you've spoken very wisely of the many cells within us, that our identity is not just focused around, one aspect, but various aspects, and they all come together. But it strikes me that, this deep focus on, particular strands of our identity can sometimes get reductive. If you focus too hard on it and you build these narratives of oppression and victimhood and so on, and I think they don't have enough respect for individual complexity and individual autonomy, and those can get eroded, where you just, once you embrace that narrative of yourself as a victim, you might be condemning yourself to a perpetual feeling of victimhood, which can't be good, and, which is something that one could otherwise get across. Now, without sort of getting into specifics, is this something that you think about? I mean, even within this movement, of course, it's one thing that there are many differences, but those differences get, more and more heated over time. Just a few months ago, J.K. Rowling would have been considered such an ally of the movement. And then there was this, vociferous backlash against her, and she was called transphobic and all of that. Without getting into the merits of the case per se, is there perhaps an issue of too much zealotry here, and also of the reductiveness, which is kind of dangerous, where you only see yourself as X without accepting that we all contain the whole alphabet within us to varying degrees?
So very briefly, yes, I think off late, and certainly social media, etc., have amplified a lot of. It has been very easy for a lot of people to take positions, and it's not just social media. If you look at the nature of our television, if you look at the overall toxicity, not just in India, all over the world, I would say, in terms of position taking and attacking the other and so on. So I think it's very easy to lose out on nuance. It's much easier for people to look at what the differences between each other than what unites us commonly. And certainly within the queer movement, we have seen in India and other parts of the world, it's easier to have differences than to say that, we are under one common umbrella. And one can recognize that one is under one common umbrella and still recognize the issues with that umbrella, right? I've always said, I think the queer movement, really, we also need to deeply reflect. And this book is also a call to the queer movement to ask ourselves, what histories are we telling? Whose histories are we telling? But having said that, I'm given that at least, this book is very much set in business, and it's very much a call to action, and it's an action-oriented book. I like what Devdutt calls samvad, not vivad. So I like conversations, not confrontations. I'm very okay with disagreements. I think the world would be very boring without disagreements. But I like disagreements that are respectful, and we don't always have to agree on each other's perspectives.
So you won't stop talking to me just because I don't like Shah Rukh?
No, I mean, will I try overtly and covertly to influence you to become a Shah Rukh fan? Of course. But that is samvad. No, I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
I won't say you like Shah Rukh. I was like, no, okay, there's hope here. Let me show you. Have you seen Paheli? It's an underrated gem. Maybe you like Shah Rukh after that, right? And even if you don't, then I will say, okay, you're missing out a lot. What can I say? Maybe we can find something else to bond over. See, but my aim, that's my thing, right? I mean, so even with this book, right, the aim is very much to get people to hire more queer people like me. I mean, the book has been written as a manifesto to get people to understand that queer people matter. We need jobs, we need recognitions, we need equality. And with that stated aim in mind, I think Samvad is a better answer within the movement and outside. Because when you do Samvad, you always leave the door open for possibilities. I think more and more when we do Vivad, we shut those doors. And I think where the world is going, the more doors we open, the more bridges we build, it's better.
Very wise words. And I would just add to that by saying that I found your book such a wonderful read that I think either of those terms, memoir and manifesto, or even both of them together, don't do justice to it. So I, recommend everybody pick it up and read it, even if you feel that, hey, this subject doesn't interest me. I'm not LGBTQ. Why should I read this? Even then, it'll open your eyes to the world around us. And a lot of it is just universal. Like so many passages within it spoke so intimately to me, like what you wrote about many selves and so on. For a final question, I'll turn away from the book and back to you.
Rapid fire. Is there a hamper?
No, I can't. I'm sorry. This is a virtual this thing. I could give you a virtual hamper. What is to stop me from?
Kejo ke show pe hamper milta hai.
Sir, I am humble person. I am not Kejo. I am
Pehle
Eva.
kyun nahi bataya?
Eva sounds good, actually. Yeah. Okay, so I watched this interview of yours from 10 years ago on this excellent series called Project Bolo. All these links will be in the show notes, by the way, so please check them out. So the excellent series called Project Bolo, which had conversations with various people from within the movement about their lived experiences and so on. And in that interview of yours, this quote struck me. And this was 10 years ago, so I asked you about it today. And you said, I want to live in interesting times. Stop quote. And now that, the preceding 10 years have certainly included many interesting times, and I'm going to end this show with my staple question to all my guests that looking ahead, maybe just looking ahead 10 years and not too much, what gives you hope and what gives you despair?
What gives me hope are all the young people that I have met on this journey. The world, the future of the world, not just the queer movement in India, belongs to the young. And whether it is young queer people, I write in this book about this incredible young poet in Jabalpur who's out to his family and whose father buys him mascara very normally, to this wonderful lesbian couple I met in Lucknow who are living a very happy life together, to the young founders of these brilliant intersectional queer spaces across the country, whether it's Ya All in Manipur, Zukya in Assam, Queerabad in Ahmedabad, Queerala in Kerala. There's so many, right? There's Awadh Queer Festival. There's so many festivals, organizations, places, things. Chinky Homo Project out of Delhi that addresses Northeast. I spoke about Grace Panu already and a Born to Win Trust. Pink List, which is at the intersection of political activism and queerness. There's a whole list, and I end the book with about 200 of these organizations. A Dalit Queer Project, Queer Muslim Project, all of which are looking at various aspects of queerness. So what gives me hope are these incredible young rainbow warriors striving to really not just imagine, people like Duty Chand, right, who have come out, who are out and proud and running for the country. People like Narthaki Natraj was honored by the present government with the Padma Bhushan, for as the first transgender, I think that the first transgender dancer to win this award. So many state governments, I would say, across the country who are recognizing that inclusion is an imperative and are slowly building the networks for it, whether through welfare boards like, Maharashtra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and so on, or other initiatives. So, what gives me hope are these young, incredible change makers who are, in a sense, pushing everyone around them to imagine, to create, and to live in this, tomorrow, which I've called with great love and affection, Queeristan. What scares me is that our present generation might disappoint them. The passion and the power of their dreams and the interconnected equal world that this tomorrow's generation is imagining is so strong and so beautiful. And I really wish and hope that some of us who are running the world today either join these tomorrow's queer, action superstars, or step out of the way, but not get into their way. So that is what gives me, that is my fear.
Your words of hope are very inspiring, but I have to say that, your words of despair are a bit overstated, because I don't think you'll disappoint anybody with this wonderful, remarkable book, which I think will be read for hopefully decades from now. Parmesh, thank you so much for coming on my show. It was so good to catch up with you again after so long.
Thank you. And it was exactly 3 hours, so it's perfect. It's the length of a wonderful old-style Bollywood film with Shah Rukh Khan.
See, I know now that if you compare me with Shah Rukh Khan, Shah Rukh is winning. So this is, but thanks a lot. I'm going to go and, search for Paheli now and watch it just out of respect for you, Parmesh.
Yeah, thank you. And to everyone who's listening, thank you so much. Lots and lots of love. Mwah.
If you enjoyed listening to the show, do check out my show notes for links to much of what we discussed today. These include links to Parmesh's wonderful books, Queeristan and Gay Bombay. Do pick them up, and if you like them, do give them to friends who you think might appreciate them. You can follow Parmesh on Twitter at ParmeshS. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AmitVarma. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.